indicate to us in the chat box where you're joining us from. If it's Lagos, you could just put Lagos. If it's Kano, I think someone already mentioned joining from Kano. If you're joining us from outside of Nigeria, just indicate in the chat box. We just want to know where all our participants have an idea where our participants are joining us from. So let's go. Yes, I see Lagos, Adamawa, Oshun, Lagos. Okay, Abuja, of course, they are in the mix. Jigawa, Hadeja. Nice one. Thank you for joining us from Hadeja. Sherry from Lagos, you're welcome. Marielo Kunchi from Lagos, thank you. Matthew, Nigerian pilot from Abuja, glad to have you. Alfred Ajayi from Oka in Anambra State, good to have you. Thank you for joining. Great, I think the overwhelming majority of our participants today are from Lagos. All right, so keep that coming. Thank you so much again for joining us today. This 10th edition of our Capability Enhancement Workshop for Journalists. It's a brilliant milestone. I'm sure you will agree with us. As we start off, we just want to share some ground rules, housekeeping on how this session is going to run so that we'll have a very seamless afternoon. Next slide. Okay, like you will have seen in the notice that came up on screen, this session is being recorded. And if you don't wish to be part of a recorded session, you might wish to drop off now. We're recording this, of course, so that we can subsequently share the recording, make it available on our platforms, and you can go back to it and as a reference material, and others who are unable for one reason or the other to join us today can also get a chance to have a playback. Your microphones will be muted for the duration of this workshop for obvious reasons. I'm sure you appreciate that. We want to make sure we have as little disruption as possible. However, we still need you to participate, and just like we did with the question on where you're joining from, we're looking to, you can use the chat room, the chat box, or even the question and answer box, which I'm sure you can navigate to, depending on the device you're using. It could be on the side or at the bottom of your screen, to post questions, comments, and any other, thought, decent thought, of course, throughout the duration of this workshop. After every session, we would look through the chat box. We would take questions there and field them to the facilitator to, respond to your questions. And we'll do our possible best to respond to all questions asked. But in the interest of time, where we are running behind schedule, we would collect some of these questions and then get back to everyone with a response. All right? So thank you very much. That sets the ground rules. We'll now be quickly proceeding into the workshop itself. We're going to have a total of 5 sessions. Hello, technical team, please move the slides to the agenda. All right, we're going to have a total of 5 sessions, starting with Bolanle Adekoya talking to us on Nigeria's Sustainability Index, and all through to Taiwo Oyedele joining us at the very end to speak to us about the reform agenda. Without much ado, I would now be inviting Dilia Asuzu, who is the regional head, the first facilitator for today. All right, Delia, sorry.
Hello, everyone. I hope you can see me. I hope you can hear me. Thank you so much for joining us. This is our 10th annual Capability Enhancement Workshop for journalists. It's 10 years, and since its inception in 2013, it's in 2013 when we first started this, I don't think we envisaged that we would actually do 10 years. So we're really proud to be able to say we have done 10 years of this. And in those 10 years, we are so proud to have reached over 500 journalists and covered over 38 topics. These topics have included, your traditional topics like finance and accounting, cybersecurity, financial and data journalism, investigative journalism, and so much more. So this edition will certainly have very interesting, very, topical issues. Will be on media in to disseminate the sustainability agenda in a credible way. And this will be taken by the head of our sustainability unit, Bolanle Adekoya. And then after that, we're going to have Agenda 2050, Brain Capital and Growing the Nigerian Economy. And you all will know that Dr. Nevin is very passionate, and many of you will be for Agenda 2050, Brain Capital and Growing the Nigerian Economy. This session will not be complete if we don't talk about artificial intelligence, right? And so we have Rotus Odiri, who's going to take us through some tips and tools to enhance your capacity as a journalist, on and offline. And after that, we will have best practice in journalism, ethics, and data protection. I'm sure this is going to be an interesting session because this is one of, if you like, our influencers. And she's Chioma Ilozumba, and I'm sure you will enjoy that session. And the last session, who better to talk about redesigning Nigeria's fiscal policy and taxation landscape for inclusive development? Don't go anywhere because you can be sure that that will be a very exciting session to listen to. And that will be taken by Taiwo Oyedele. I hope you all have a fantastic, session this evening. Obviously, there's many topical issues here, but this is our way, if you like, of giving back. And like I told you, we have reached over 500 journalists since we started this initiative. This is just one of the 2 initiatives that we hold for the media because of the very important role that you all play in society. And we hope that we have, in some way, added to your body of knowledge that you keep on learning, because it is a learning journey. PwC is all about learning, and we hope that we've managed to impart to you as well that quest for knowledge. And so our goal has always been to do that, to help you in the way that we know how to be able to carry out your duties. And so we wish you really interesting, and I'm sure you're going to enjoy the rest of the evening.
All right, thank you so much, Delia. Yes, it's all about continuous learning, and at PwC, we are proud of our purpose to build trust in society and solve important problems. And we thought it is a good way to contribute to society by bettering the quality of business and other types of reporting. Hence, these initiatives that we have specially geared towards the media. And journalists as a whole. We're proud again that it's our 10th edition. You're welcome if you're just joining us. Now we're moving straight to the first session, which is on Nigerian sustainability outlook, ESG credibility through journalism. Our facilitator this afternoon, we have the pleasure of having Bolanle Adekoya. She's a partner. She wears many hats, I must say. She's a partner. She's Africa Inclusion and Diversity Leader. So she's part of the Africa leadership team of PwC Africa. She heads our capital markets advisory and accounting services in the West Market area. And she is also, most importantly for this session, the head of our ESG and sustainability platform. Please welcome Bolanle Adekoya for this session. Bolanle, you're welcome.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. And I'm glad to be here. And well done to Silva and the team. And well done to every single one of you for making the time to be here. I'm hoping that this will be an interactive session. Silva, how long do I have?
Well, 30.
Okay, that's fine.
30.
Okay, so hopefully we can achieve a lot in that time. So as Silva's already introduced me, so I'm just going to carry on. I'm sure that a lot of you have all heard about all this, what's the sustainability thing, ESG, everything. Everywhere you go, people are talking about COP28. You know, they've done COP26, they got COP27. You've heard about net zero, and all these things are going on. Silva, I hope you can still hear me, because I know that my bandwidth, it seems things are shaking, but hopefully everyone can.
Loud and clear, Bolanle, we can hear.
Fantastic. You. Okay, yes. So what I want to do today is to just give you an introduction to what people really mean by all these ESG and sustainability reporting that is coming, and some of the standards that cover it, and why this is being done. Next slide, please. And for you as, you know, hold on. Okay, next slide, please. So, yes, here. So for you as journalists, it's very, very important that you understand why it's important that you know what it means when you're talking about ESG. ESG, actually, in the long and short of it, it's about individuals and stakeholders taking responsibility. The meaning of ESG is environmental, social, and governance. And it is one of the key pillars of sustainability. Because the truth about it is that it's about people taking responsibility for the fact that everything that we do affects our society. So our policies and our processes affects our society. The way we hire people affects our society. The way we run our businesses affects our society, because it affects climate. I'm sure all of you have heard about global warming, and then the way we structure our businesses affects our society. So because of that, it's about the reason why we have all this ESG reporting is for accountability, so that people who make this impact are accountable. So ESG, as I said, is part of our sustainability sort of responsibility as human beings and everyone, you know, and it has three pillars in this sense. So we're looking at environmental, the social pillar, and the governance pillar. And what I've done is just to help you sort of look at what this entails. It entails climate change, so now environmental, climate change. So things like carbon emissions. Carbon emissions is like simple things like when people are manufacturing their products, how are the emissions they are giving from their CO2 affecting the atmosphere? Even the flights that we're taking when we travel, how does it affect our carbon footprint? Even things around the just normal things around waste is also one. Pollution, waste, packaging. Are these things toxic to your environment? I'm sure in our environment, you'll see all over Nigeria, we have plastic everywhere, blocking our motorways, blocking our waterways. So the idea when we sort of have some of these things is that these companies should actually talk about what they are doing about it. So either they are paying for it, in a sense, they're cleaning up and paying for it, you know, maybe clean up our water, or They are finding ways to compensate for the impact of it. So those are what the ESG is trying to do. The other side of it is social. What does social entail? Social is looking at human beings, looking at how we look at things like, yes, stove and firewood cooking. Yes, everything is affected. So social is looking at simple things like the balance between male and female in your organization. How are you dealing with the impact of it? How are you dealing with supply chain? When it comes to modern day slavery and labor, are they using companies using 10-year-old people on their farms? Do they know that this is happening? All of these things are very important. Even when it comes to data and privacy, I understand Chema, on here, Pastor will be around later to talk about it. So how do you deal with things like data and privacy? When you're reporting as a journalist, are you taking responsibility for that? Then even access to information, are you aware of it? Access to finance, access to opportunities, nutrition, especially in our world. If you think about it, there are some organizations, I'm sure you're aware of the past things that have happened with people like Shell and all these other people. There are past organizations that even when they go into environments, they go into towns or states, are these companies looking at the impact of what they are doing on the welfare all around them? So it's about pushing them to take responsibility in there, instead of having all these companies, including multinationals, come and rob the environment, rob us socially, rob us, and then disappear. Then the other key area is G when we talk about governance. Now, the governance pillar is that the truth about it is that all of these things, someone has to take responsibility of it. So who are the people that are running these organizations? Are they ethical? So when it comes to that governance pillar, it's looking at things like the structure of the organization, looking at how are they ethical? Are they corrupt? Are they bribing governments? Are they politically exposed people in there? Are they transparent with their tax? Are they contributing or taking out from financial systems and stability? As you all know, some of the big multinationals, they say all these things, but are they really, really there? So when it comes to ESG, there are opportunities around there for people to take responsibility, but there are also opportunities for creating and generating values. So one of the things that you will find when it comes to ESG is not about just compliance or reporting or the term that you heard greenwashing. I'm sure people have heard about the term greenwashing before, where some people will say that they're doing certain things just to look good and get external investors. However, we know that they're doing opposite. But it also creates opportunity for trading. So for example, in the world now, when those companies that are able to decarbon the work that they do, so they're going towards net zero or actually reducing their carbon emissions, they can only trade and accumulate carbon credits and put it towards their tax. They can use it to offset future tax liabilities. They can also trade it to actually create value and generate value. It also gives them an opportunity to even reduce simple things. So I'll give an example. Please go back. I'll give an example. For example, in developing world, some companies are using their CO2 reduction. For example, in fizzy drinks, beverage companies, when they reduce they're reducing the CO2 emissions in there, they are now they're able to trade it and make money for it. So it allows them to even give us healthier drinks for the society. So this is very important. And the one thing that underlies and creates this urgency for us is the fact that resources are scarce, and our environment, our planet needs to eventually regenerate itself. If it doesn't regenerate itself by us putting the right policies and processes in place, we will eventually not have a planet. As you can see, the degeneration around us, even in Nigeria. So that's why you hear climate change, net zero, sustainability are all important. Next slide, please. So at PwC, one of the things that you will find that as PwC, we are very, very key, we're very intentional with the way we formulate strategy to deal with some of these important issues. As you know, we are very, very involved when it comes to solving problems and being a community of solvers and solving important problems. So we actually came up with a fundamental strategy to be able to tackle some of these issues because we knew that this was going to come. So some years ago, some of our leaders came up with what we call the ADAPT forces methodology, sort of an acronym of some of these issues that are there. And it's also because of the fact that we knew that some of these changes was inevitably going to come. So ADAPT forces from a PwC point of view is something that, as I said, we used to classify or bucket some of these issues and then how we address them. So we look at asymmetry. We know that there's increased inequality in the world. As we can see around us, we know that there's a lot of inequality. The rich are getting richer, poor are getting poorer. In some countries, things that shift. Look at India now. India is the new frontier. There's a lot of development happening in India. They've managed to succeed in that side. But when you look at Europe, look at the challenges that they're having, look at issues with Russia and Ukraine. So there's increased inequality happening. There's disruption. Within disruption is being affected by technology, significant events like war, deeper global reception post-COVID. As we all know, COVID devastated, apart from the health issues, COVID actually devastated the world when it comes to supply chains and productivity. And all of these also, so ESG, focusing on ESG issues actually help address some of these issues. And of course, technology with the development of AI and all that's coming through. We look at age. As you know, there's greater insecurity for our youth because of the fact that in some sides of the world, the youth population is increasing, while from other places, it's you have an aging population. And you now have a situation some of hid away from the growth of other nations because of the brain drain that is happening around us. But can we see those brain drain as an opportunity for growth? But we need to also know that even with this mass relocation and Japa syndrome, that way we cannot ignore it and we need to talk about it. So what are we doing with the other up and coming youth that are coming? Do we have the right structures in place? We need to develop those other ones that are coming, especially given how populous we are as a nation. Polarization, as you know, that within countries it's increasing, and more, increased racial tensions, ethnic tensions happening all around the world. New age things like the LGBTQ and all these gender issues that are happening, that is dividing the world more and more. And then, of course, then the last area where you come in, how can you, as the media team, armed with the right information, help with building trust? It's not just about negativity all the time. How can we help with the fact that people now do not believe in governments? We don't believe in government. How can we see the positive side of it? I know bad news sells, but is that really always the way we should go? Can we have a better and balanced view about the opportunities that are available to help us grow our nation? Next slide, please. So let's now look at the key sustainability trends that have been happening around the world. As I mentioned earlier on, you would have heard some of the commitments that were made by nations, bold commitments in the last COP26 and 27. So even with the Africa Carbon Market Initiative that says that we can generate 300 million carbon credits annually by 2030, because all of this is money on the table, So now carbon credit up to $92 per unit, but it's gone down over time. But all of these things can also generate wealth in that sense, and also finding ways of sort of creating new products and other things that can happen with the electric vehicle, recycling and all that in that sense. How can we make use of that? Things around the energy transition plan, in someone like Nigeria making net zero commitments to be net zero target by 2060. That is not a long way away, especially because our high dependency on fossil fuel and the fact that our key fossil fuel is also a key source of wealth for our nation. How do we then move away from that, given our populous nation and our dependency on it? So some of these sustainability are things that we need to look at. Investment in things like gas infrastructure. I'm sure you've seen quite a number of gas projects that are coming in. We need to sort of bear in mind that these are positive things. And then the movement of some of these IOCs out of our nation, who are then focusing on some of them transitioning. So things around energy transition, what's going on there? Collaboration between the public and private sector, with a number of things moving to the private sector, in that even developing infrastructure. How do we keep that? Policies and initiatives to incentivize sustainable financing to help us mechanize our agriculture production as a nation. Now, one of the things I want to mention here that has happened is that how can we as media people be advocates for us doing some of these policies to be consistent, so that you don't have certain organizations going to make separate side agreements with government, and we are banking our future away. When people make, they sell futures towards future taxes and things without doing it properly and it being of benefit to our nation, and actually properly investing our infrastructure. Things around our Africa-led initiative around the Great Green Wall Project, looking at vegetation and how we can actually build and transport produce across the nation. If you think about it, even something as simple as even Nigeria, we have the North and Middle Belt and Niger, our sort of Middle Belt, as I said, with quite a lot of opportunities, but we have transportation issues, moving food across board, dealing with that. So capacity issues and understanding in that sense. The last thing I'll mention here is on material topics that people keep talking about is things around people. We know, as I said, it's, I've mentioned it before, looking at what can happen also with AI. We mustn't forget, that's why we have a session on artificial intelligence. AI is coming to replace people's jobs in some cases. Some people say even 300 million jobs, 600, we've heard so many things in the next 5 to 7 years. What are we going to do about it? Do we see it as a problem or as a challenge? How can we upskill to be ready to take the more strategic roles, looking at that? Wellness and development, the increased number of suicides that we're finding in our nation, which is unacceptable. How do we deal with these issues in that? We mustn't forget the planet. As you can see, at the moment, Nigeria, where previously April to September, we knew rain, August, we knew when rainy season would be. But now it's raining pretty much every single month all through the year. All of these things are climate change, and they have effects on our produce, maize, tomatoes, plantain. It affects our produce. How do we look at this and make sure that we're able to reduce our emissions and have a mechanized way of dealing with some of these issues in that sense, and even waste management? And then the last thing is on prosperity. How do we then take those things and then actually increase the benefit to us as a nation? We have the opportunities, but we need people to talk about it, invest in it, and understand that we need to invest in our future now rather than later. So it's not just a compliance thing, but we're thinking long term. Next slide, please. Okay, so one of the things that I also wanted to mention, that ESG is not just the responsibility of the company. Every single one of us has a responsibility. You have the regulators, the unions, everyone has a responsibility from the compliance and the pushing side. You have communities and yourself as press. We need to talk about reputational impact. How do we call out people who are not doing what they're supposed to do, or who promise something and are not doing it? So one of the things that you as media people need to look at is how you interpret data. So when you pick up the financial statements or some of these reports that companies put out there with regards to their measurement of water or their people measurement, how do we then get them responsible for that? Even them hiring people with disabilities, people with varying abilities, how do we then do that? Of course, you have the internal drivers, which are mainly focused around growth and opportunities and just being accountable. But we need to look at this. Things around value chain and supply chain, which affect all of us. Shareholders and investors are also interested, because nowadays, for you to get external funding anywhere from around the world, you need to comply with these ESG considerations, because they won't give it to you. They set KPIs that you need to look at. And later on in my slide, I'm going to give you some of the sort of frameworks that a lot of companies use around ESG in that sense. And then making sure, of course, that our customers and our other stakeholders like yourself are not affected by the toxicity that may also come around if things are not done properly. Next slide, please. Okay, so you yourself as, so this slide just follows on from what I said. So you yourself as journalists, the main area for you has to do with how you record and publish some of this information. How do you communicate it? Are you an advocate for good, or are you an advocate for bad, or are you an advocate for propaganda? And the truth about it is that you also have to look at the ethical side of it. It's about challenging and being armed with the right information. Understand the objective of ESG disclosures. The first objective, as I mentioned earlier on, is about people taking responsibility. The second one is about being accountable. So when you're accountable, it has to do with being transparent, being honest. As media personalities, you also need to make sure that you do your due diligence and not just jump on it. Remembering that whatever you post out there can also affect the relevant stakeholders positively or negatively. Sometimes, even you, without realizing, you create greenwashing without realizing, without putting the right information there. That is why we're having some of this session, so that you can go away and arm yourself. I don't have enough time to go through, the real sort of nitty-gritty of ESG, but there's a lot of material out there that you can use to read up about it and why a lot of companies need to do it. By the end of this year, into 1st of January 2024, all companies to comply with the ISSB S1 and S2 standards on ESG. The S2 standard is looking at climate change, so things around the emissions that we talked about and other sort of decarbonization and other areas. While on the S1 standard, there are other ESG disclosures that they need to look, that they need to report. And the framework is, and within that, there are additional frameworks that are in there. So you have some certain terms, which I'll show you shortly, which you can go on and look at some of the statements that are being made and make sure that these companies are doing the right thing. Next slide, please. Okay, this is just, as I said, some of the current gaps. I think I've already talked about it. Trust breakdown. We know that a lot of companies are not really living up to their commitment, but they keep talking about it. I've talked about regulation. So you have one that's coming up. There are a few regulations in the pipeline. So SEC, for example, has, is sort of looking. They've published and made some bold statements. As you know, that the Vice President's office has also put together a committee around climate change. They are also putting that, and they want to put in penalties for breaches in those standards that they set. Supply chain accountability, looking at it. So let me give an example, a very simple, mundane supply chain accountability that we can talk about. Sometimes even the Lagos-Ibadan Expressway, some of you that know, when you have some of those trucks, there's combustion and the gas goes up or petrol tanker goes up and people unfortunately die or lose their life, property is dealt with. Who takes responsibility? This is the time. These are the things that will force people to be accountable and make sure that they put the right safeguards in place to ensure those type of things are avoided as much as possible. Things around vendor and supplier resilience. So how do you deal with products, around there, even things, as I said, around labor, modern day slavery, and of course, transparency as well. Next slide, please. Okay, I'm going to skip this slide. I'm going to leave because I've said a lot of things there. Next slide, please. Yes, here. So let's talk about media. So media as the fourth power. So we talked about ESG conversations. I sort of tried to give you a high level, around it. I didn't want to go too technical so that you can sort of understand the broad area. But what I want to talk about is media as a fourth power. Remember earlier on, I talked about the fact that what are you recording? Are you reporting? Are you an advocate? Are you recording, doing something politically? Is it propaganda? What are you doing? But you, as the media, have the responsibility, first of surveillance, making sure that, with the existing regulations that are there, and you're able to look at what companies are actually doing, the statistics that they put in their reports. I can tell you a lot of companies will come up with all sorts of statistics. They will say, even the telcos, they'll say that their towers are only doing maybe 1 unit per TCO3, all these emissions that they keep coming up with. So how can we make sure and monitor that some of this information is authentic when they're using generators, for example? How are they able to meet with that? So there are other benchmark information that are available out there that you can look at, even look at comparison companies. So if, for example, a telco here, a similar size telco in another African country, let's say Kenya, and you're comparing between them, what does it mean in that sense? Information, disseminating information or around new policies, regulations around ESG as they come out, and the key building blocks. Education, you being aware, creating awareness, talking about sustainability and climate change. Interpretation, looking at reviewing information, checking facts, countering facts, exposing the sources of disinformation or even discrimination of information. So let me tell you sometimes, some people will report the good, not always the bad, or they will overemphasize the good, which we call greenwashing. So being able to spot those things by comparison. Sustainable development. So yes, please post your question. Sustainable development, and then being agents of behavioral change. So for example, if we are looking at our waterways and we're seeing plastic bottles, PET bottles of a particular bottling company in this country or particular beverage company, we need to talk about it. Styrofoam, when we deal with things like styrofoam, plastic bag, pure water, how can we find alternatives? When we see alternatives other places, can we talk about these things so that behavior can happen? And people in certain walks of life, different, so for people who may be in maybe middle or upper class, may be aware of this impact. But people in the middle to lower class, the lower middle class, may not be aware. How can you give them information about the fact that there are positives to doing this thing the right way because of the fact that it will improve waterways, help with the weather, help with even where they are living, and all sorts of things that may come out of it. Thank you. Next slide, please. Okay, I've talked about this. I think we can, I can just sort of mention the last one, what I said about the upholding integrity and build trust with ESG communication. Next slide, please. Thank you. Actually, go back one. Sorry, there was one thing I think I saw on the third point. Yeah, so the fourth point about educate the public on climate change and ESG related issues. I cannot overemphasize it. And that has to do with what you do as the media. So I am going to stop there so I can open up for questions. There are quite a lot of, Silva, you will need to help me with some of the questions because they're coming fast and free. So can you read them out and then we can then talk about them?
Precisely. Thank you very much for your session. Very insightful. I'm sure we have all learned something. It's very easy to think, when you hear ESG, to think environment, just environment. But I think we know very much that the S and the G there are not just for decoration, S for social issues, of which there are a whole lot affecting the world. And of course, governance issues, corporate governance, business conduct, ethics, and the likes. Who would have known that JAPA is an ESG issue? We get to understand that alongside things like polarization, equality, access, and all. And importantly, Bolanle has also made it clear that everyone is involved. It's a responsibility for everyone. But importantly, for the media, carrying out surveillance, bringing information, educating the public, and holding everybody accountable, really, to ensure that we're doing the right thing. So thank you very much, Bolanle, for the session. We'll now take questions from the chat, and I'll read them. First off, Godi Ofuse, you had asked if this presentation would be shared. Yes, we would publish the presentation alongside the recording, the audio recording, subsequently, and make them available on our platforms for download and for playback. All right. Now, Joseph, you asked, Joseph Olaoluwa, please, what is the quickest, easiest, or fastest way to check ESG in financial or capital markets reports? That way, we can monitor firms when they disclose their financials. This is essential for, say, financial institutions who may not have a physical product or a styrofoam. Joseph, I think you've asked just the very right person to discuss capital markets report. Bolanle, over to you.
So in the director's reports, for usually around that investor statements, they have what they call a sustainability report. Some of them may call it an ESG report. And in there, they would disclose what they are doing around sustainability reporting. They usually need an external party to assure it. Now, there are various frameworks that they would use. So, for example, the GRI, which is the one that they used to use before, which was the Global Reporting Initiative, the one that the World Bank used to use, that people used to use, is that one. They may say that's what they started their ESG strategy with, and then they will put the KPIs that they are meeting. There are set KPIs that they are meeting. So, for example, they will say, for our S, for example, or our emissions, we want to stay within this particular number of units or percentage, and then they will now have a table of how they have achieved it. So you can then look at it and sort of say, is it comparable? And then you can look at other comparable companies to say whether it makes sense or whether it's possible. Some of them can also use something called the TFCD. That's the task force for climate change, the disclosure around that. So that one is usually around emissions. I think there's about 4 pillars some of them may look at. So for things like oil and gas companies, telcos may be using that. Or for the financial services companies, things around how they generate power, and how those affect some of their branches, head office, those different things. They might talk about how they may offset, maybe planting trees or using solar. We can talk about it. Another very common one is around the SASB, which is the new one, which is part of the IFRS ISSB S1, S2. So ISSB is the Sustainability Standards Board, the International Sustainability Standards Board, who have just issued 2 standards that they want IFRS reporters to look at. So in there as well, they would also have one. And then there's the European one. So the Europeans, for example, if you have companies that have European debts, some of them, they'll be using the EU climate reporting framework, that one as well, the requirements to be in there. So it's usually in the part before the number, before you get to the actual income statement, is usually at the beginning, before the auditor's opinion. Thank you.
Brilliant, Bolanle, thank you so very much. We have the next comment here. Well, it's more of a comment than a question from Taiwo Oyedele, a journalist reporting from an online platform called Upshot Media in Lagos. He says, emphasis has always been on media deficiencies or what they should do better. Better for the society, I guess. But I think organizations and NGOs should ask what the problems are in the industry.
Yeah.
Taiwo, I believe, yeah.
Yeah, no, correct. But as I said, the media can do both. You can also educate. If you educate, people will be better informed and speak about it in a more strategic way as well.
All right. We'll take this as the last question for this segment. Or if you still have all these questions, you can probably let's take this one from Otua Abasie Kong, pro-share, friend of the house. Their fellowships and partnerships to ensure ESG media reporting and sensitization on climate change in the country? Are there fellowships that people can be part of?
Well, unless you join a course from a university or something there, I mean, there are online certifications and things around that maybe take 3 to 6 months to have a look at, or there's actual sort of information that you can read online as well, apart from the actual fellowship and partnership. But there are some available, and you do have some NGOs and charities and things that are also pushing in those areas as well, that want to encourage people to do this. Also the data company. So one of the things that I did mention earlier on, data is a big challenge when it comes to ESG. That's why it makes ESG reporting harder. So that's why also how we keep and mine data is very, very important as well, both for the various stakeholders as well as yourselves as journalists. Thank you.
Thank you again so much, Bolanle Adekoya, for a very insightful session and for your responses to the questions that have been fielded by our reporters and participants on this workshop. Thank you very much. I will say, just perhaps as a last word, that ESG and sustainability is so important that for business and business reporting that we've included it as one of the categories in our 2023 edition of the PwC Media Excellence Awards. We're looking to celebrate and reward the best sustainability reporting out of Nigeria. And I hope that we sent in our entries. The gala night for the announcement of the winners of this year's prize will hold next week, Friday, the 6th of October. And we look forward to having all of you. Thank you again, Bolanle. We'll move quickly to the next session, which would be facilitated by a very own Andrew S. Nevin, who I'm sure most of you are familiar with, a very good friend of Nigeria and a friend of the media. He was as well chief economist and partner here at PwC. He's currently a research professor on brain health and the inaugural director for the Brainomics venture. That rings so much like Nevinomics. Andrew will be speaking on 2021-2025 lessons from the past and insights for the future. And I'm very sure he's going to also say a few things around brain capital and the Nigerian economy. Join me as we welcome Andrew Nevin for his session at this workshop. Andrew, please.
Thank you, Silva. Can you hear me?
Very well, loud and clear.
All right. So it's a great pleasure to be here with you. I mean, I think many people are aware that I retired from PwC Nigeria on June the 30th. PwC has mandatory retirement at 60, or the June 30th after you turn 60. So in fact, the day I joined PwC, I knew which day I would retire. And it was, but I, very happy to retire in the sense that I think that it's a policy that serves PwC. It would serve others well because we need the younger generation to take over. And it's great to see PwC and the nation grow as much as it did in many ways. And it's a great pleasure to see Bolanle and Silva and others here today. And a great pleasure to see all of you here, all the people from the journalist community. I mean, it was very important to us as PwC and to me personally, the relationships with the journalists and the role that you play in Nigerian society. I mean, I've often said if I had to compare countries, I mean, I lived for 10 years in China, and I lived for 10 years, more than 10 years in Nigeria. And I preferred living in Nigeria because, I mean, despite all of the challenges that we understand, it was an open and noisy democracy with many voices in it. Whereas in China, of course, I think people are aware, even if you haven't visited, it's a very closed society where you can't say what you think. So thank you so much for all that you do on that. I'm going to talk. I'm not going to use the slides. They're from last year. You can appreciate, of course, having left PwC, I don't have the same support systems to prepare slides. And sometimes I think we have too many slides. So I'm just going to talk about a few things that are important. And I think the topic I'm meant to talk on is more about brain exports, which of course is close and dear to my heart. So let me start with a couple of remarks about journalism and some counsel for the journalists. These are remarks that I've made at the awards dinner that we have for the Journalist Awards every year. And a couple of things. I'm very positive on what the journalists do, but there's two things that I would just like to highlight before I talk about the economy. The first one is at times financial journalists, business journalists give a false sense of importance to things that are not really important on that. And I'll give you an example. When I see a headline that says the NGX has had a gain today of 23 billion or a loss of 17 billion, and then the journalists try to attribute that meaning to that, that to me is an error. I mean, particularly in the stock market, we know it's a little bit of a random walk. Stock markets go up or down. And to take these kind of relatively small movements and give them meaning, I think is an error. And I think that I always encourage you to have a little bit of critical thinking. What's really going on? Why is this important? Is it really important? And I'd like to see less and less of that highlight of that type where, the NGX is moving a small amount. Related to that is something that I've spoke about over the years and actually written about, which is we are giving in the country, I think, a false credibility to statistics that we shouldn't be. And one thing that we do, which is, I think, quite damaging, is we take the official statistics for all the decimal points and we try to attribute meaning. So when the NBS issues, and it's not a criticism of the NBS, I mean, they're working under very difficult circumstances, but we have someone comes out, the NBS comes out and says inflation this year is for the last year is 21.21%. And last month it was 20.88%. It's rising on that. I would really caution us to, one, no one can estimate inflation to 4 significant digits. I mean, in other countries, it's actually usually just to 1 decimal point, 3.1%, 6.8%, not to 2 decimal points. And particularly if you're up around the 20s, I mean, I'm not even sure 1 decimal point is really relevant. And secondly, it's just not even clear we are capturing the inflation rate. I think everyone on this session today would say, for example, food inflation, I think the official number is around 27, 28%. But in fact, if you go to the markets and you look at all the products individually, you find many of them have gone up 50%, 100% in the period in question on that. So I would really caution us of taking these statistics and then giving more meaning to them than we should on that. And of course, the economy is much bigger than the official statistics, and it's going to be rebased. Again, we're going to have, the rebasing, I think in 2013 was about 50 or 75%. The economy almost doubled overnight. So what does it mean when we rebase? I think it'll be at least 25 or 30%. So if you come out and make a comment on today's GDP, and then next month the NBS does the rebasing and the economy is 30% larger, that really means all the comments you were making about the smaller GDP prior to the rebasing are irrelevant or are actually factually incorrect. So I would really caution you with the use of statistics, these spurious extra degrees of digits, and really have some critical thinking about that. So those are my 2 comments on journalism. But now let me talk about the economy on that. And I think the way I think people should be looking at the economy in the country. And let me start by saying, people might realize the primary way we tried to have an impact in the economy during my time at PwC was through these white papers. So we didn't put out quarterly forecasts. Those who've heard me speak on television say I'm not interested in forecasting the future. what I'm interested in is changing the future. So there's no point in forecasting something that you're trying to change. I mean, the economy is going to do what it's going to do. But what we were interested in was putting big ideas on the table that would really change the narrative. And I think as journalists, you should also be thinking about that too. It's not just reporting what's happening; it's putting the big ideas out. Like Bolanle talking about ESG. It's a big idea. It's very important to the nation and the world. What can you say about ESG, particularly around the climate issue, the environmental issue? But on the economic side, we put out these white papers. That was our primary way of communicating the big ideas. The first one we did was in 2015, where we really got deep into the cost of corruption in the country. And the reason we did it was we got tired of hearing these headlines that said, 100 billion was siphoned off here, 3 million was found in cash over here. 1 billion was siphoned off in the oil money, because we thought it didn't really capture what was going on. It was just a little bit of noise around numbers on that. And so we did a very detailed economic paper that looked at how the growth rate is depressed by corruption. So it's not just the individual piece of corruption, the individual actor, but what happens is it has a knock-on effect that affects the whole economy, which we all understand viscerally. But we went back to the academic literature, studied that impact, and we then came out and built a very robust paper that said, look, if we had the same corruption level as Ghana over the last 15 years, our economy would be about 60 or 70% bigger. And that really caught the attention of everyone. In fact, before we released the paper, we presented it to His Excellency, the Vice President, on that. And we realized that that was a good way to help set the economic agenda of these white papers. So we wrote a number of others over the years. But the last three that we wrote during my time there, I think were, to me, the most important, had the biggest impact. So prior to COVID, we wrote the paper around the biggest export being brains, not oil. And the reason we wrote it was we got tired, and I got tired of hearing people in the media, in the government, talking about how oil was the biggest export. And of course, those have heard me speak, particularly about 4 or 5 years ago. I will often say, look, we have 200 million people in the country. At the time we were producing 1.7 million barrels of oil, even less today. So about close to 800 million, 700 to 800 million barrels a year. So about 3 or 4 barrels per person, but half of it goes to the IOC. So by the time you get down to what actually benefits the nation, it's about 1 to 2 barrels per person per year, which is really negligible. And then we looked at what was happening with the diaspora. When we came out with our paper on it, no one was talking about the diaspora, and yet the flows were immense. I mean, the World Bank number on it was about $25 billion flowing back to the country in 2019. So we put out the paper that said, actually, our biggest export is not oil, it's brains. And we thought that was, fantastic news. We called it the barbell economy because we exported in Nigeria the lowest value-added thing in the universe, which is crude oil, and the highest value-added thing in the universe, which is brains. So we had this dualistic economy, and we wanted the brain exports to grow faster on that. And of course, most of the brain exports at that time were through the diaspora, and that really changed the narrative. NIDCOM formed, it became very important. Everyone now understands the criticality of the diaspora. Government policy has changed to make more welcoming to the diaspora. The diaspora is making not just a financial difference to the country, but making a difference politically. It's strengthening the governance by their demands on the system. And one of the things that was really heartening for us and for me personally was to see so many states take a diaspora strategy. Because you realize, of course, the diaspora, individual members of the diaspora may not be so attached to the Nigeria idea, but they're definitely attached to their individual states. So you've got Edo, Lagos, Ekiti. Nearly every state now, I think, has an effort around the diaspora. So for us, we were very proud of PwC to take this big idea, challenge what was being said out there in the narrative about oil being the big export, show that it was actually brains, and then have policymakers and other actors build on that to really build up the brain side of it on that. So the second paper I wanted to talk about that it really had a difference the last few years is the one we did on India and Nigeria. And again, this arose because, I have to say the critical thinking that we're trying to do at PwC. So there was a narrative out there. I went to so many conferences and I read so many papers and journalistic articles that talked about Singapore model, talked about the China model, talked about the Korea model, talked about what happened in the United States. And we sat back and we said, well, if you really think about it, first, every country is unique, and Nigeria is unique, and there are unique attributes. And 2023, 2021, I think, when we wrote the paper, is a unique time in history with technology where geopoliticals are. So while it's useful to learn from some of these models, the most important thing was Nigeria built an economic model that was based on where Nigeria is, and not just a wholesale talk about Rwanda. I mean, I got tired, and I think I heard from others that that His Excellency the Vice President just got tired about hearing about how great Rwanda was, and is it really relevant for Nigeria? So we put out a paper that said exactly that. We need to find our own development path in Nigeria that's relevant for the conditions of Nigeria that we find ourselves in today, the strengths and the weaknesses, and build that. And part of the reason we wanted to say that too was as a counterweight to the kind of IMF, World Bank orthodoxy. I mean, the IMF and the World Bank come with these formulaic things they have to say. I'll come back to one or two of those in a minute. They go up to the policymakers and say, other countries do this. This is what Nigeria should do. And we really oppose that. So we wrote this paper and we said exactly that. Nigeria needs to find its own development path based on the unique strengths and challenges in Nigeria. But one country where we could probably learn the most from is India. And the reason we chose India was it has many characteristics that are similar to Nigeria. First, it's a big scale. I mean, so often if we look at the Rwanda example, we would say, look, I would say Rwanda's 10 million people. It's had its own unique history. It has different challenges. What they do is not necessarily relevant for us. 200 million people, very many tribes, historical issues around the country, divisions across, with large land mass differences between the north and the south, between the east and other parts of the country on that. But you can't say that India is less complex than Nigeria. The second thing about India is, it's roughly the same GDP per capita, and it's faced many of the similar challenges on that. So, how to rise incomes, how to deal with insecurity around different parts of the country, how to deal with large land mass with different geographies on it, rural poverty, agricultural base on that. And they found many innovative ways in the last 20 years to deal with it, particularly using technology, which is something that Nigeria has shown as strength. So we wrote that paper, and that paper took a little bit longer to have an impact, but I can really start to see the impact, particularly with the new government in place. So His Excellency President Tinubu, I think, was at the G20. Maybe His Excellency the Vice President was at the G20. Nigeria was a special invited guest of the Indian government. There's a lot of recognition that Nigeria-India cooperation is very important, and of course, Nigeria is supposed to pass the United States, I hope, in my lifetime in population, which would make India and Nigeria the largest two democracies in the world. So it's very important from a geopolitical viewpoint, in my view, that we see India and Nigeria work closely together. And we're seeing more and more of that. I've heard from many people from the new government asking about how India has addressed some of the similar challenges that we have. So that was the second paper of the last three that have had an impact. But the third one, I want to spend some time on the time remaining, because I think it really is the most important thing that I was involved with in PwC. And it grew again out of the people talking about the way Nigeria should develop and about industrialization and about exports. We all understand we need to export more. We need to export more oil, because the primary reason that we're having the inflation and the pressure on the FX right now is actually because of the reduction in oil hydrocarbon production. So, it's reduced. It was about 1.7 million in 2014, 2015. It's reduced down to as low as 1.0. I can't remember last month. It jumped up to 1.3. It fell back in August. We'll see what it is in September on that. And that's putting immense pressure on it, on the entire system. But in terms of the way forward, you go back to the paper that we said the diaspora exporting of brains was the biggest export in Nigeria. And if you have an economy where you're exporting brains, so you're exporting the highest value added thing in the universe, it made no sense to us that people were coming along and saying we should be looking at, sorry, let me just plug in my computer before I run out of power. I don't want to lose you all. Just bear with me 1 second.
Right, just to remind us that you can post questions for Andrew using the chat box so that he can take those after his presentation. All right, thank you.
Sorry about that. So as I was saying, we have a situation where we have this barbell economy. So we have the oil exports and we have the grain exports. And if you ask yourself which one should you grow, I mean, I think it's pretty obvious that you should be growing the grain exports. So people came along and other people said, look, there's a normal development path, a normal industrialization path. We could take China, we take Korea. So when your GDP per capita is not so high and you have a large agrarian population, what you want to do is start low-end manufacturing and then gradually move up the value chain. And Korea has been a very successful example of that, at least economically, after the Korean War in the 50s. And people came along and said, that's what we should do. And we looked at that and we said it made absolutely no sense to us for a few reasons. One is a negative reason, which is, I mean, it's incredibly challenging in our environment with the power situation, with the infrastructure situation, with the port situation. And don't have any comparative advantage in low-end manufacturing. But the bigger reason was we were already having success in exporting grains. So why would you adopt a strategy that says we're able to export the highest value added thing in the universe, and we're going to go backwards and we're going to export low-end manufacturing goods? It made no sense to us. And then people came along and said, well, the problem with the exporting grains is the JAPA syndrome and a brain drain on that. We came along and said, actually, the world is changing. And this goes back to the point on the India-Nigeria paper where we need to adopt the economic strategy that's for the circumstances of the day. So, the JAPA, when you JAPA, you're exporting grains, but the grain is moving physically from Nigeria to Canada, physically from Nigeria to the United Kingdom, physically from Nigeria to the United States, where I am today on that. But in fact, in 2021, in 2023, you can now export grains without people leaving the country, without leaving their home on that. And of course, this has been going on for a while. It started sort of in the 1990s with India, again, as being an example of a country that could export grains where the grains remain in the country. But as technology has moved along, and companies have realized that they can tap different sources of talent around the world, this has gathered steam over the last few decades. But COVID was a game changer, because COVID made us realize that, in fact, you can, in fact, in many cases, be more productive without having to physically move from your place on that. And my own COVID journey, I mean, I evacuated from Lagos in April of 2020. And I thought the economy around the world and in Nigeria would collapse. But in fact, people adapted, including ourselves, to be able to deliver the same or better value remotely. I worked from Canada for 6 months. I wanted to wait till I was vaccinated before returning. I worked in the UK for 9 months, continued to play my role on that. And for Nigeria, I mean, as terrible as COVID is, it's something that is open an enormous opportunity, because now young Nigerians, without leaving the country, have access to tens of millions of jobs around the world on that. I mean, we train these young Nigerians, but the size of the formal employment market, many of which are in the government, which are really strapped, is very small. So then graduates can't find jobs. But when you now open up the global job market so that now young Nigerians have access to jobs around the world, it is a complete game changer. And just to put some numbers on it, I think there's about 30 million software developers around the world. Obviously, AI, which I think we're going to talk about a little bit later, is an important thing, but I still think there's always going to be software developers on that. Almost all software developers work remotely on that. So Nigeria has access to those 30 million jobs. Well, there aren't 30 million jobs across all sectors, formal employment jobs in Nigeria on that. And of course, we put out this strategy, but it was already happening on that. And, as we were developing it and talking to people and then came out with the paper, we were amazed at the stories of not just Outsource Global, which I talk about a lot. So this is the leading outsource company from Nigeria, which exports Nigerian brains in software development, in call centers, in business process outsourcing, in the legal profession. They outsource in accounting. So we can see a day when, hopefully PwC Nigeria benefits from it, but where the majority of the work done in accounting may be done in Nigeria and not in the United States, and not in the United Kingdom. And Amal Hassan, who's a national heroine, started this company. She has 1,500 employees who are exporting brains, sitting in Kaduna, sitting in Abuja. She's opening a new operation in Gombe. So you can have a young person in Gombe participating in the global value chains. And we said that has to be the future for us. Why would we go back to manufacturing fans, low-end manufacturing, people earn low wages, rather than exporting brains? And again, I think it's been very gratifying for us to see the impact that is the right strategy for the country. And I think it's the strategy of the new government. So His Excellency Minister, His Excellency Honorable Minister, both over at, I can't even remember all the telecommunications and information technology, I think, has come out recently and put that 1 million target. We put a target of 2 million over 10 years. I think he's put a target of 1 million brain workers, exported brain workers, over the life of this administration. So he's even more ambitious than us on that. And the other thing about the global value chains, of course, is that one of the reasons we looked at this was if you looked at, again, the conditions of different countries. So Bangladesh has been very successful economically, and in ways is similar to Nigeria in the sense that it doesn't have much of a centralized state and government on that. And they built their success on what they call ready-to-wear garments, just clothes, exporting garments. And they've done very well. In fact, their GDP per capita has passed India. I was in Bangladesh in December. Very impressive on that, and really all credit to them on that. But they built on their unique circumstances. One of the things that's unique about Nigeria is its ability to project excellence in the world. So despite all of the challenges that we have in Nigeria, we still have world-class Nollywood being exported. We have Burna Boy, Fireboy, Tiwa Savage. Other countries that are in similar situations actually haven't shown this excellence. We have people, I come to Texas now, I've moved to Texas to take up this new role. Everywhere I turn, I find Nigerians in very senior roles, professional excellence, the medicine, in the legal profession, in the business community, at the university as well. And that's a unique characteristic that Nigeria needs to build on. And that's part of the brain export strategy, is the ability to be excellent at very high order tasks. And I do have to say, before I wrap up, of course, the greatest export that Nigeria's ever made is Giannis Antetokounmpo, who of course was actually born in Greece, but he's Nigerian on that. And I'm sure everyone is aware he's the superstar center for the NBA Bucks, but that's an individual Nigerian who's created over $1 billion of value in this world. But of course, we have so many in the football world on there. I had a great pleasure last May, watching Taiwo Oyedele keeping Nottingham Forest in the Premier League. He scored 5 goals in the last 3 games to keep them up on that. Eze over at Crystal Palace essentially did the same thing. So it's fantastic to see so many Nigerians in global value chains adding value, and that's the strategy we want to bring to the country, and it's being embraced. The last thing I'll say before I wrap up is, one of the highlights for me in Nigeria was the book that we did on self-organizing Nigeria, self-organizing Niger. And this was a collaborative book. There were 6 of us, 3 foreigners and 3 Nigerians who did it. Of course, one of the Nigerian authors everyone knows here is Rufai Oseni, who's like a brother to my wife and I, who is also a co-author, my wife. And the way this book came about was really simple, and I think has implications for all of you as journalists. About 2017, I used to give the speech about the country getting poorer and poorer per capita, et cetera, and all the terrible numbers. And eventually I just said, there's no point in just repeating the bad news that everyone knows. That was just pointless. And it also didn't fit with what I was seeing on the ground. As I said, a big part of my experience in Nigeria was trying to apply some critical thinking. So I'm reading these terrible statistics all the time. They're being endlessly repeated. particularly by our frenemies over at the World Bank on that, about how terrible things are in Nigeria. And yet every day I was meeting people doing amazing things. I mean, I named Amal Hassan, but literally every day I met Nigerians, particularly young Nigerians, trying to doing incredible things under very difficult circumstances. So for me, there was a critical disconnect here. We were repeating these, terrible stories about the bad economy and the bad situation and multidimensional poverty, and yet I was seeing this excellence every day on that. So the book came out of that, out of that thinking with a group of us, where we essentially said, let's actually tell some stories about things that work, and the things that work in Nigeria, because the government is so ineffective, were things that were self-organized. So people could self-organize their own education, self-organize their own security, self-organize their own power. And that's what the book told the story about. And it was a big highlight. I think it was very well received on that. And I would urge you as journalists too, to tell more of these stories about people. I mean, some of the things that are happening, and I'll cite kind of one or two just to wrap up, just amazing to me, given the challenges that we all know that we're facing, and the ability for people to think of, whether it's an NGO or a private company, how do we solve a problem in this difficult situation? But one of them that for me was incredible, and I think is fundamentally changing the country, is the SPPG, so the School for Policy, Politics, and Governance. And just some background to this. I mean, I think everyone knows Madame Obi. Everyone knows in the 2019 presidential election, the third-party candidates, it wasn't like Peter Obi's run last time, but the third-party candidates really struggled. My friend Kingsley McCullough told me a year before the election that he had a path to the presidency. We all know that none of the third-party candidates really caught fire. And so Madame Obi went away and had a bit of a think about it. She was up in Berlin. She had a fellowship from, one of the institutes up there. And I actually went to visit her in Berlin and had a 4-hour conversation with her about it. And she said, excuse me, she said something really powerful. She said, what she had realized was that to change the nation, her running as an individual candidate would not have an impact. I mean, even if she got elected, she would just be within the system. The only thing that she could think of that would change the system is if you created an entire generation of leaders, of governance leaders, who would enter politics, either elected politics or some other role within it. And as a group came in with the right ideas, the right values, the right ethics, understanding governance, understanding politics, understanding economics. So she set out to create an organization that would do that. Of course, others are now, she isn't really involved day to day, but others have taken over. Dina Mina, for example. And it's an amazing organization, and it's really an example of self-organizing. Madame Obi saw a problem. No one asked her to solve this problem on that. She just set out to say, I'm going to solve the problem of governance in Africa and governance in Nigeria, and then governance in Africa around the world. She came up with a solution. She brought other people into it. So all of the faculty, I am one of the founding faculty members. We're all volunteers. We give our time at no charge on that. Brought in a system to do it. And it is incredible the impact it's having. It's up to I think we're about to enter the 4th cohort of it. Cohorts are over 200 people. So we now have close to 1,000 young Nigerians who are a community from the graduates of the SPPG. Some of them are starting to think about running in different offices. They're in every state in Nigeria. And that's just an example of the self-organizing principle. So let me stop there and just to summarize my main messages again. Just in terms of day-to-day reporting, I really like to see some critical thinking around numbers, headlines, statistics, and just making sure that you're really thinking through, is this meaningful? Why are there so many significant digits? The second main message was that what we found in my time at PwC, and I'm most proud of, is being able to put big things on the agenda. So thinking about what the narrative is. So the narrative was, we're an oil economy. The narrative is the government has to do everything. The narrative is, corruption is bad, but this is just the amount that's stolen. We did some critical thinking and came out with a different way of looking at things, written in a very analytic way that changed the direction of the country. And the third big idea I'd like to leave you with is the self-organizing principle. People sometimes view it as a negative. Oh, we're self-organizing because the government's not so strong. But actually, I think for the future, if you think about the challenges the world faces, things like COVID, things like AI, these are fast-moving situations. Anything that's centralized is not actually going to be, in my view, the best organizing principle. I think that what Nigeria has, that self-organizing ability, the self-organizing impulse is so powerful, actually it should be thought about, analyzed, nurtured, because in the world that we're moving to, actually self-organizing is going to be the only way to thrive. So let me stop there. I'm happy to answer any questions. And again, thank you all to the whole journalistic community for being such good friends and such an important part of my time in Nigeria. I'm still connected in my current role. I've reserved 20% of my time for Nigerian activities, and my wife is actually in Nigeria today. She did another PwC event on that, and so we're still very much connected, and we're very, very proud to have been part of the Nigerian story. And I hope to live long enough to see Nigeria live its potential. So, Silva, happy to take any questions or comments from you.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Wow, I mean, guess it's so fitting that your current role, you have some presence in the ivory towers, because you've just engaged us for the last 45 minutes speaking with our slides. Shows your passion for Nigeria, your understanding of the issues, and your willingness, like you've just told us, to continue to engage around these issues for the love you have for Nigeria and our potentials. Thank you so much, Andrew. We have a few questions, or in fact, we have quite a number of questions, but we'll go through a few of them quickly within the time we'll have. Charles Akpeji and Sam Diala asked similar questions around the deficiencies you see in Nigerian journalistic reports and your suggestions on the way out on those deficiencies. You mentioned some of those at the beginning of your discussion. Perhaps they're looking for you to shed a bit more light on those, and perhaps also give some suggestions on how they can improve. So if you just take that one.
Yeah, no, I think in our awards we see lots of very good pieces. So, and even today I was reading something from one of the papers, and it was excellent. So there's lots of good reporting. I think as journalists, maybe what would be something you could do. Obviously we're trying to do our part, but it's just episodic every September and early October. I think what would be really helpful is if you took the things that are good and shared them with your friends and journalists, and particularly the journalists who are more experienced, for your younger colleagues. Say, look, people are only going to be able to do good work when they know what good work looks like. So it would be nice if the professions, maybe you should also do your own awards and say, look, we're going to celebrate what is good, but these are the types of reporting that is really powerful in the profession on that. Because as I said, a young journalist coming up, if they're not trained in what good is, they're not going to produce good pieces on that. But as I said a little earlier, and I've said over years, one thing that really upsets me is this use of statistics. And of course, it's not just the journal. The government starts it, the NBS starts it because they put out these spurious numbers. We always in our papers, I don't know if people remember this, but we always used to have a little box that said we use the official statistics because we have to, but just be aware from our perspective, there's too many significant digits, it's too uncertain. Even I'll give you a small example of kind of lack of critical thinking. People are regurgitating the NBS statistics on exports, but in fact, a lot of exports are not captured. Last time before I left Nigeria, I had a very interesting conversation with someone about the export of garlic from Sokoto to Morocco, and of course, this was not getting captured by any official statistics on that. Or I don't know if you've read numbers from the NBS around saying we have a current account surplus. Well, we don't have a current account surplus. That's saying we have more exports than imports. Because first off, if we had a current account surplus, just this critical thinking, the Naira wouldn't be under such pressure. It's not possible to have a current account surplus and the Naira be under that pressure. But secondly, what was happening was that we count all the oil exports as exports because we can capture that, but we don't count the the import of all of the oil services in dollars that counteract that, because we need a lot of those services which take a huge value of the oil, and it's not measured on that. But yet we report as though we have a current account surplus. Or I'll give you another example, just a lack of critical thinking. We for years used a chart around gross capital formation, and the chart had the gross capital formation around 16-17%. And some of you may have seen me stand up and say, look, we can't grow 6% unless the gross capital formation is up around India's level, 26 to 30%. So there's a gap. People are not investing in Nigeria. Let's talk about that. Well, suddenly in 20 and 21, the gross capital formation moved up to 31%. I don't know whether the MBS was listening to me, but they put out this number. The World Bank repeated it. It is mathematically impossible to be correct. I mean, first off, you could never have an increase from 16% to 31% in 2 years. Secondly, if it was at 31%, stock market would be going crazy. The Naira would be appreciating rapidly. I mean, it's just not mathematically possible. And yet the NBS put that number out. The World Bank repeated it. I called the World Bank and they just said, well, it's the NBS's number. We're just repeating it. So it's that critical thinking that I think that, again, I'd like to emphasize, but the only way people are going to get that critical thinking is if they see, me saying, oh, do critical thinking isn't necessarily very helpful. What was more helpful is if you distribute among journalists, here's an article that did a very good job, use of statistics, critical thinking, zooming in, zooming out, big picture, individual stories, and people see what good is.
All right, thank you, Andrew. Another one here from, I'll take this from Ayode Ola from Kiss FM, Abuja. Do you think the entertainment industry is well structured to contribute more to the Nigerian economy and, of course, to the Nigerian people? What can be done to better structure it?
Well, this is interesting. If you go back to Nollywood and music, I mean, the government was not involved, and Nollywood kind of boomed on that. So I would be, and of course now everyone's taking an interest in it in government policy. So my own view is and I think we cited in the book, Nollywood's a very example of self-organizing Niger, and have done very well. So my own counsel on this is, I don't necessarily want to see the government do a huge amount. And they can do a few things. There's the new fund from the AFDB. We built some film studios on that, but you go back again to the conditions for success in Nigeria. What has not worked in Nigeria are big programs run by the central government. So whether it's anchor borrowers, there's other agricultural interventions, mass metering, all of these programs have ended up being corrupted. And that's one reason why, and have not achieved their objectives and have indebted the country. And of course, there's also capital expenditures that have indebted the country. I mean, how much did we spend on CCTV camera? I mean, I read 465 million in Abuja. Where has that money gone? I mean, the airport terminal in Lagos was $100 million. And, now the minister is having to force the foreign companies to move in because it wasn't built the way it needs to be built. So I'm very reluctant to introduce more programs in there. I do think, and something I haven't talked about today, except in the diaspora, I mean, over the years, I've been very consistent, and we've been very consistent, saying, look, development has to happen at the state level. I mean, there's 200 million people, there's 36 states. It's very difficult from Abuja to create anything that's going to affect all Nigerians. So again, with Nollywood, I mean, I think if there's going to be more policies and structures, I would prefer it to come from Lagos State than from the federal government.
Okay, there is a topic here that I'm sure, is very topical for most Nigerians, and that is the exchange rate. Oluwakemi Abimbola has asked here that the Naira is taking a serious beating on the Forex market, and we also have these changes in the CBN with the new governor coming in with 4 new deputies. What do you think can be done to stem the tide and strengthen the Naira?
Well, I mean, I think that, there's, just having better governance in the CBN and that kind of confidence, and that, I have massive confidence in the new governor and the deputy governors, but it's just to be really blunt about it. The last time, when I was still in Nigeria, I said very clearly, the reason we're having this foreign exchange crisis is completely the government's fault. We're having it because of the reduction in hydrocarbon. So if you think about what was going on, I mean, as I said before, 2014, 2015, we had about 1.7 million. Back when I arrived, we had 2 million, 2.2 some months. And then the government allowed hydrocarbon production, whether it was neglect, whether it was, active, to decline to 1.0. So it's inevitable in that circumstance that we have a currency crisis. And in fact, it was made worse by the oil subsidy, because oil's hit $95 today. So if you're subsidizing oil at $80, $90 and you're not producing any oil, we subsidize 650,000 barrels a day. So if we're only producing 1.0 or even 1.2, we're exporting very little. So it was inevitable that by allowing hydrocarbon production to decline so much, we would have a currency crisis. So what did I said before I go is, number one priority for the government is having the multiple exchange rates will not solve anything. It's getting hydro production up and building confidence are the two things that will stabilize the Naira. But one of them, I don't know what's going on with the hydrocarbon production. I pray it's improving. But certainly, the manager of the CBN. What we're going to find out from the forensic audit by the ex-chairman of the FRC. I'm very interested in the CBN, but essentially from all the leakages, the country was giving dollars to privileged actors at a lower rate than the market rate. And I think people want to know, who are those privileged actors? Why were they getting it? Were they actually contributing productively? There's been all sorts of press around Olam receiving the dollars, of course, and then round tripping them. And if that turns out to be true, that's just a grievous betrayal of the country by a foreign company, but as well as a system that just encourages corruption. But I have a lot of confidence in the CBN, but we just need to get that hydrocarbon thing moving in the right direction as well.
Thank you, Andrew. I'll just take two last questions so we can move on. Combining questions from Taiwo Oyedele and Matthew Dadia. They're really just asking, Nigeria's got fantastic policies. So what does government continuously get wrong as regards the implementation, and how can that change? And then also, rather to that, if you could explain a bit more what you feel are advantages and disadvantages of the JAPA phenomenon.
Yeah, so I think on the first point, I think anyone, I'm pretty old by Nigerian standards, well, by any country standards now, and I've had a lot of experience. You cannot create a centralized program that is successful in under a decade. So this idea that we're going to have, every time there's a problem in the country, this federal government up till now has always said, we're going to create a problem to address it. And then they form a new MDA, a new board, new DG, and then 2 years later, we find out that a lot of resources went into it and we got no result. So please, let's stop doing that. I think that this state-led development, I would like to see the federal government come out and say, look, we're going to do a few things with the federal government that we can do, but 80% of what has to happen in the country has to happen at the state level. And and if you elect a good governor, you'll get some result. And there are lots of states that have really moved forward in my time in Nigeria. There's some states that haven't, but the federal government can't compensate for the states on that. And I would like to see a much more honest assessment of that. And of course, the CBN governor at his Senate hearing came out and said they're going to stop these intervention programs because it deflects from the core mandate of the CBN. It's been distracting, and they haven't been successful on that. So I think that's a good step on that. And you go back to the self-organizing principle. If people are self-organizing, you don't want to stop that impulse. So design, an intervention by the government that actually builds on Nigerian self-organizing impulse, and it has to be designed at the more local or state level. That's my view. On the JAPA syndrome, I think it's fantastic for the country in the sense that, Nigeria, one of the things maybe it's not apparent if you're in the country is, for its stage of where we're at, it's so connected to the rest of the world. As I said, it's got people not just in entertainment and sports, but in every sphere around, particularly the English-speaking world, in senior positions, doing amazing things. I mean, India is really starting to reap the benefits of its diaspora in the last sort of 5 or 10 years on that. And it's interesting. My wife is of Indian origin, and so she actually did the first study for KPMG on this issue of brain drain back in the early 90s, because people were very worried Indians were going abroad to work or to go to school. And actually, they found out it was a huge, even back in the 90s, it was a huge positive. So it's a huge positive for the nation, not just financially. We talked about the financial flows, but I do think it's having an impact on governance. So, for example, you go back to these diaspora commissions at the local level, at the state level. They all want to raise investment funds. Well, the diaspora who are giving the money are saying, we're happy to be part of an investment fund, but it has to be well structured, well governed. If there's 7 board members, 5 of them come from the private sector, leading business people from that state. Maybe of the 5, 2 come from the diaspora, 2 come from the government, but the government can always be outvoted. So I think it's having a huge impact. And I'll tell people, Nigerians, I mean, not every Nigerian, we understand that, but you have millions of people in Nigeria who are very sophisticated on a global scale because of the connectivity with the diaspora, and gives them that connection on that. If I had to compare it to China, when I first went in 1983, I mean, a very insular country, very few people knew much about the world. So we have a very complex world, and we have a Nigeria that's very connected to it. And I think that's a benefit, not just financially, but overall to Nigeria.
Thank you, Andrew. And I will just take the last one from Otua Basie Kong. He talks about the recent launch by the new government of a talent export program, TALEP. He's asking how optimistic you are of this initiative in enabling Nigeria leverage her brain capital.
No, I'm very optimistic. I mean, I'm glad the government is doing this. I mean, we wrote the paper on brain exports, so it makes the most sense to us. But one of the things I didn't say before, that is one of the reasons, and we wrote, was that this strategy is so important, is the government doesn't have to do very much. The brains export themselves. I mean, I had this, when I was talking a lot about it, people would reach out to me. I would get a LinkedIn connection request from a young man in Kano, and I read his biography, read his profile, and he was doing AI work for a telecommunications company in Canada. So I reached out to him and just had a conversation with him for 15 minutes, because I wanted to know his story. So he was doing this not like in Amal Hassan's Outsource Global. He was doing this as an individual, and he was doing it from Kano. So he told me his story of how he got involved and founded, and he's building a house for his parents and gets paid in US dollars. And I just thought that was fantastic. I mean, he figured out how to insert himself in the global value chain. So I think that the reason I think the strategy of well constructed will do well is you don't need to do everything as the government. The people, they're so motivated. I mean, obviously, as the exchange rate gets worse and worse, if the economy's bad at home, people want to earn a living. There's, as I said before, 30 million going to 42 million developer jobs. There's hundreds of millions of BPO jobs, tens of millions of call center jobs that are all available to Nigerians on that. And the Nigerians individually are so motivated to be part of it. So I think if the government does a few simple things to support it, I think it will be very successful on it. And I want to contrast it a little bit. And it's not a criticism, but if you think about the Dangote refinery, and we had that sham of a commissioning back in May, I think, because the president, I guess, wanted it, but still has not produced any output. I mean, we put $19 billion at least of the nation's dollars into this refinery, more than 10 years, and there's no output from it. So, when you have this very large single project, created so much risk in the system. The thing about exporting the brains and the talent while they remain in Nigeria is it's very modularized. I mean, so this one person can do it on their own, but if one person does it on their own 1 million times, we have 1 million people working abroad. When Amal works with a client, they often start out 10 people doing remote work for a client. And if that works, they go to 25 people. If that works, they go to 100 people. So it's very modular. You can have it happening all over the country in every state. So Edo State, I mean, Governor Obaseki is already quite a long way down this path, already has software developers employed by by foreign companies. I know Equity State is doing something, Lego State is doing something. So it's the distributed nature of exporting brains to me that's very attractive. Again, not a criticism, but I compare it to the Dangote refinery where we put so much in, and 10 years later we have zero exports out of it on that. So let me stop there. It's been a great pleasure to be with you this morning. I hope that what we've discussed has been helpful. And again, the journalist community is so important to the country. You do a fantastic job. Continue to thrive and grow. And God bless Nigeria.
Thank you so much, Andrew. We know it's a bit early on your side of the world. Thank you for joining us, making this presentation. We're so proud to have you, not just as a member of our very rich PwC alumni, but also as a honorary Nigerian. We wish you well in your endeavors, and we'll look to continue engaging you on issues critical for Nigeria. Thank you so much, Andrew, for your time. Okay. Thanks, everyone, for your questions. We would be proceeding, of course, to the next presentation. However, in the interest of your physical health, haven't sat down for a bit, we want to encourage everybody to take some time to stand up from wherever you are. Just stand up and have a stretch, a little stretch. Okay, if you are maybe at home, you could go grab something, a bottle of water, remote control, anything that makes you exercise for a bit, and then you can come back as we take the next session. So, quick exercise, thank you. I hope you're doing it. Thank you. And for those who were asking, Andrew has clarified about his email address. The punctuation error, he's fixed it now, and you have his address in the chat box. Okay. Hopefully we're back. Thank you very much for that. So we'll be moving on to our next session, facilitated by Chioma Ilozumba, Legal Advisory on Contracts at EKDC, a good friend. She'll be speaking to us this afternoon around best practice in journalism, the emphasis around ethics and data protection, which is a very critical issue of the day. So join me in welcoming Chioma to speak on this. Chioma, the floor is yours. Okay, I have a quick message here from Chioma. She's just had, I think, a bit of a technical issue. She's coming back on, so let's just give her a few minutes to join. She'll join shortly. Please, I think she's joined. I'll ask the host, please unmute her, make her a co-host again so she can proceed with her presentation. Thank you. So Chioma, you can unmute now and speak. You are a co-host.
Okay, hi, good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to thank PwC for always organizing this. Sorry, let me quickly take off my other devices so it's echoing.
All right, it will appear Choma has just got a bit of a glitch with the devices, but we expect she will join back shortly to continue with the session. Just, please give us a minute. Thank you.
Okay, Nze, could you please confirm that I could continue?
I can hear you loud and clear. Please proceed.
Okay. Okay, great. Sorry, I went off for a bit. Yeah, so I was saying that typically we don't expect that, 30 minutes would be able to understand fully, but I always enjoy, saying that my approach is always to break it down like we call it the layman term, very easy to understand and as quick as possible. So we can begin with the slides. The slides, please.
Yes, the slides are up.
Hello, Choma, are you still there? Hi, Choma, are you there?
Can you hear me?
Okay, we can hear you now, Choma. You can proceed. The slides are up as well. Confirm you can see the table of contents, yes.
Yes, I can.
Okay, please go ahead.
Okay, so I said over the next 30 minutes, we're going to run through the basics of data protection and privacy for journalism practice, the intersection between journalism and data protection and privacy, journalism ethics and compliance with data protection and privacy, and understanding the principles of data protection and privacy as relates to journalism. Next slide, please. Okay, so we're here because we all know that journalism is an essential part of what holds any society together. You guys are the ones who help us with information. When we want to have questions asked, our journalists are always there for us. And when I say journalists, I'm speaking to both the print media and the broadcast media. I'm also speaking to indie journalists, and I'm as well speaking to media houses. So this is, of course, to let us know that despite the fact that we are to disseminate information, journalists are not exempt from legislation. And the core of this session is to make sure that the journalists understand their responsibilities as well as their limitations. We all know what a lawless society could, turn to. So it's always important that everybody can be lawyers, but you should always arm yourself with at least the basic knowledge of any law that affects the sort of work that you do. So in Nigeria, we have what we call the foundation of all laws, the 1999 Constitution as amended. We also have the Freedom of Information Act. And then recently, we have as amended, the Nigerian Data Protection Act of 2023. So we can see that journalism and protection and privacy usually coincide with each other. So at what point does the right of one prevail over the other? Next slide, please. Okay, so when we say data as referring to, in this context of journalists, what exactly are we talking about? Are we talking about figures? I heard a panelist earlier, say that it was important that journalists learned how to interpret financial data. So, but in this sense, as regards the data protection law, anytime we say data, we're actually referring to, information about ourselves, information about our organizations. So when you say data protection and privacy for journalistic practice, it simply refers to safeguarding personal data from misuse, from mishandling, misrepresentation, unauthorized access, or compromise in any form. So when you say personal data, just think of anything at all that helps you identify any human being. You could think of their name, you could think of their photos, you could think of their house address, even their social media handles today. So these are all the sort of things that, we look at when we're saying, let's protect information, let's respect people's privacy. Next slide, please. So how does journalism and data protection / privacy, how do they come into each other? And this is simply because the sort of work that journalists do, we find that oftentimes with your news reports, with your investigations, you would usually have to handle certain details about people, which brings us to their personal data. Sometimes you would be revealing the full names of people, you would be revealing their social media handles, sometimes you tell us where they live, you could describe their office for us as well, telephone numbers, email addresses. And when we say media, we're talking of their photographs, voice recording, video clips, IP address, means of identification, and sometimes financial information. So for instance, you hear that EFCC has arrested somebody, and to prove or to add credence to your report, you're attaching certain bank records or statements to your report. So this is how your work allows you come into hold of certain information that otherwise you would not be dealing with. And then we also have sensitive personal information. So criminal records of people, their sexual orientation, their health records, state of origin. Oftentimes, it's very important that we distinguish between general personal data and sensitive personal information. So just to have like a quick overview, I always say sensitive personal information, we should look at it as anything that we know that once we're releasing it, it prejudices the person or creates a certain bias against them. So for instance, in Nigeria, if you describe someone's sexual orientation in your report as different from what we consider the norm, you're already setting them up for drags. If you come in contact with somebody's health record, say for instance, somebody has HIV, you cannot just go out and be revealing that in the ordinary day-to-day performance of your job. So generally, this is where journalism and data protection, this is where I say they often coincide with each other. So next slide, please. So for journalists, anytime you think of data protection and privacy, I think you should just think of three things. Think of your work, think of compliance, and then think of the NDPA. And I am hammering on the NDPA because we have, your journalism ethics already. There are things that you ordinarily should not do in the course of your work. These are principles and standards that guide your profession. And the NDPA, on the other hand, has codified certain things that the moment we attach sections, if somebody is bringing an action against you, it's no longer just vague. It's no longer saying, oh, as journalists, we shouldn't be doing this. Oh, as journalists, it wouldn't be right if we release this or if we release that. But with the NDP, there are specifics. It's giving you the basis of compliance. It's providing for the rights of your data subjects, obligations of data processors, controllers. The NDPA defines breach, sanctions, and penalties. So what I often say to people is the moment laws come out, and that these laws affect the sort of work that you do, it's always important for you to have a little bit, in the very least, a little bit of understanding of how that law guides you and how you can come in breach of that law. So all the terms I've been mentioning, the processors, the controllers, we're going to look at them at the coming slides. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to run through very basic definitions of some of these terms. So one of the first things Section Act wants us to understand is consent. And when we say consent, this basically means that, let's think of your subjects and let's think of your sources. So sometimes you could be reporting a story about, you could be reporting about the president, you could be reporting about fraud in a company, and then sometimes you could have your source as well. So as journalists, you're dealing with two people, your subject matters and your sources. And it's always important that you understand your rights, your obligations towards these people at every point in time. So for consent, let's imagine that you were covering an event And journalism is pretty broad. Sometimes you're covering an event, sometimes you're doing some back-end investigation. So in all of this, consent is always important. So for instance, you come into, maybe if this gathering was not virtual, if it was physical, ideally what we should have is a notice to people saying, oh, your photograph might be taken here, it might be uploaded for social media purposes. You should have those sort of notices at events that you carry out. When we all logged in here, one of the data protection, and sometimes we see it play in our day-to-day lives, but we may not recognize it. I'm sure when some of us logged in, we saw, the notice saying that this session was being recorded. So those are mandatories that everybody's following, and different countries have their different laws. So even Zoom is mandated to let you know that when you're logging into virtual sessions, you're being recorded. And it's always better that consent, as I say, is documented. So this is just for logging in, this is for physical events. If you were to have a source for a story and you were, sitting with them and you say, oh, there's been a breach maybe in your office and we want to do a backstory about it, we would like for you to speak with us. It's always important for you to document the consent. You could send them an email and say, oh, I want to speak to you about this story. Is it okay by you? And make sure that the consent is affirmative, clear terms, not ambiguous. Also, do not obtain it by duress. And then when we speak of, let me quickly move to data controllers because I'll come back to consent. When we speak of data controllers, we could speak of, let me give an instance with Punch. So Punch is an organization, and then you have journalists under Punch. So at that moment, the data controller is the person who decides what sort of information you get and what you're going to do with that information. So in that moment, Punch is the data controller. Now we move to who the data processor is. The data processor is the journalist. The data processor is the person who has now said, oh, after I have been told to obtain this information, this is what I am now doing with it. Now, ideally, in a different circumstance, I would be saying data, but I'm using information here because for journalists, it's basically what your data is, your information is what you're getting. So the data processor is the journalist. That's the person who is deciding how to now go and get this information. Remember, the controller has said, this is what I want and this is why I want it. The processor, on the other hand, is the journalist who is saying, oh, I'm going to go about it this way. Data processing is anything that has to do with what you're doing with information. So if you record me, maybe I'm giving you, evidence for a story and you record me and you decide to share it, you decide to store it on your flash drive, you decide to print it, those activities that you're carrying on the information that I have given to you is data processing. I already explained your data subject earlier. Those are your sources or your subjects. I also explained personal data. I also explained sensitive data. Now, what is personal data breach? This is the moment when any information that has been put in your care has been compromised. So, for example, you have a source who has confided in you and has told you, you know what, I do not want anybody to know about this. I do not want anybody to hear about this. This is just for the information. This is just, or rather for the purpose with which I'm helping you expose this. And then you take that, maybe you share to your friend or you share to maybe your spouse at home, and then they share to someone else. So that's a breach. Sometimes when you lose information, that's a breach as well. When you mishandle information, maybe we've said, oh, this is the purpose only for which we're using this information we've obtained, and you use it for something else, that's also a breach. So if you go further and read the Act in your own personal time, you'll see more examples of data breaches and how you can avoid them. Then when we speak of pseudonymization, anonymization, minimization, these are things that just help us keep in compliance with the data protection laws. So pseudonymization, for example, you're reporting something and you found a person's name, and it's important that you protect that person's identity. So if we recall, there's the very popular, they say, oh, a Jane Doe or a Doe has been found. Those are pseudonymization because they're protecting the real names of these victims or of these data subjects. Then when you say anonymization, anonymization is not necessarily, you're not now saying, oh, Mr. X or Miss X. You're actually giving a name. So maybe you interview Chioma Iluzumba and Chioma says, oh, when you're putting this out, I don't want people to know it's me. And then you turn around and say, so we interviewed Temi Tokbe or La something. So that's on anonymization. Then minimization means that, you're allowed to milk as much as you want, but limit what you put out to what is necessary. So if you interview somebody, maybe you go into their house, we don't need the full descriptions. We don't need you to tell us where their house is. We don't need you to tell us their address. Just limit whatever you're putting out. So that's minimization. So next slide, please. So as a journalist or media house, and I'm using this interchangeably because I'm assuming that there are independent journalists here and not everybody is a staff of a media house. So as a journalist or media house, once you're the one who determines the purpose and manner for processing data, once you're the one who is processing it, it becomes your responsibility to ensure that the methods you're collecting this data is strictly in line with the principles of data protection. Next slide, please. So when you speak about understanding the principles, if you go through the Act, from about section 24 to the end, there's a lot of legalese in it. It's been written in a certain way, but I've broken it down in the coming slides. And I think every time you want to approach it, when you want to go back and do your own research, just always remember this, that there are sources or subjects, and there is information, and there is who you are as regards that information. So your sources or subjects are your data subjects. And when you think of them, you have to think of their rights. When you think of the information, you have to think of how you process it. And then when you think of your role, that's as a processor or a controller, you have to now think of your obligations. Then you also have to think of sanctions and penalties that could come to you if there's breach at any point in time. Next slide, please. So from here up until the end, we're going to run through very quickly principles of data protection. So these could all be found in Part 5, as I mentioned earlier, of the Nigerian Data Protection Act. And I've broken them down, so I've just taken very simple words from them and I'm rephrasing them here so that it's easier to understand. So the first one says, obtain and use information in a fair, lawful, and transparent manner. No trickery, no duress. So if you have a source or you have somebody you're trying to get information from, make sure that you're fair to them. Make sure you're say, oh, this is what I want to do with this. This is why. Don't trick them. Don't say, oh, if you give me this, I won't release it. Meanwhile, you know deep down that you want to release it. So no trickery, no duress. Stick to the reason that you collect it for. So if you obtain information and it is just for the purposes of putting out an article, stick to it. Don't now go and use it to, maybe you want to show your friends that you have had access to certain people or you've been in certain places. Just always stick to the reason that you've collected it from. Don't obtain any information that would aid illegality. So you're a journalist, and of course you have certain skills that could help you obtain information. So if someone is trying to blackmail someone, that's not the time for you to use your journalistic skills to assist that illegality. Use only what you need. I mentioned that earlier as regards minimization. Then do not keep for longer than necessary after you've achieved the purpose for extraction. So for example, if you record somebody, maybe they're giving you clips, don't say, oh, I might need this 20 years from now. If you need it for a certain duration and you've ascertained that you no longer need it, then don't keep it longer than necessary. Because sometimes we have access to files that people shouldn't have access to because, oh, somebody forgot that they no longer needed this and they needed to delete it. Then always ensure that information that you obtain passes the following tests. Anytime you're sitting down to speak to your sources, anytime you're reporting in the papers, anytime you're speaking on television, always make sure that what you're saying is accurate, it's complete, it's not misleading, and it's up to date. So when we say up to date, we mean that you may have obtained an information from somebody in March of this year, and there are many things that may have happened between March up until September that would make some things inaccurate at present. So you have no business still reporting and saying, oh, I got this information in March and then I'm using it now. Make sure that whatever you're putting out is always up to date. Then collect and use in a manner that is secure. So as I mentioned earlier, make sure if you're a journalist, make sure you have passwords. Make sure that your laptop is highly protected. 2-party or the 2-factor, 3-factor, how many factors you can pour in. And I mentioned again, that's not the time to say, oh, my husband says he wants to look at it. My wife says she wants to look at this. My girlfriend, my boyfriend, that's not the time. Keep your partners away from your work. Keep your friends away from your work. Where you know that your story, if you know this is your work laptop, that laptop has to be protected by every means possible. Then the next one says secure backup while storing to guard against loss and damage. So we mentioned earlier that journalists are really important. There are certain information that you would come into that we're depending on you to actually release to the society. So it would be careless of you to not back it up appropriately. So if you have information stored on one flash drive, it doesn't make any sense. You should have backup, you should have, you can use your OneDrive, you can use Google, but use whatever it is, but always make sure that important information is backed up. Next slide, please. So I mentioned earlier that, consent is really important. Understand not just obtaining consent from your subject, but when it has been withdrawn. So sometimes a source might come to you and say, oh, you know what, we spoke about this 2 weeks ago and I gave you this information and I was fine with you putting it out, but certain things have come up in my life and I no longer want this information out there and I am now withdrawing my consent. At that moment, you can no longer come and say, oh, they agreed 2 weeks ago, so I can put it out. No, always understand when consent has been withdrawn. Because in the event of a court case, anytime anybody brings a matter against you in court or a matter against you at the Data Protection Commission, the burden of proving consent will always lie with the journalist. It will always be the journalist. It's you we're always going to ask, oh, you said this person consented to this. Show us how. We're not going to ask the other person. It will always be the journalist, and silence will never constitute consent. Don't say, oh, when I told them I was going to go ahead and do this, they didn't say anything. At the moment it becomes an issue, the burden of proof lies on the journalist. I'm going to take questions right after this. I see one has popped in. Then always know the lawful basis. So there's an FAQ slide at the end of this where I have put out what is the lawful basis of processing personal data. Before you obtain consent and information, you are mandated under the Nigerian Data Protection Act to give your sources information about you, your media organization, your place of business, who to reach. So if you come to me and you say, oh, Choma, I would like to interview you for this, and I have every right to say, where do you work? If you say, oh, you work with the Guardian, then you have to provide me your full name, you have to provide me the Guardian's office address, you have to provide me who to reach in case there are issues. So if you put out, say, a press release about me, and I look at it and I do not like certain information, there has to be somebody I can immediately call in your organization. And you have to give me that information before you speak to me. So I can call and say, oh, I don't like this, could you take this down? So you are mandated to actually provide your sources with information. Then let them know what information you'll be demanding, how, why, and how you intend to use and dispose of it. So it's not just enough to come and say, oh, I want to interview Chioma. You need to let me know what you would be asking of me. You need to let me know why you need that information. You need to let me know how you're going to use it. So for instance, if you tell me that, oh, I'm going to interview you on camera, but I'm not going to put out, I'm just going to release only the audio clips, and I'm going to modify the audio in a way that people are not going to know it's you, or I'm going to blur your image. You tell me all of that. And then the next moment on some YouTube page, I'm seeing myself, full picture, full audio, then there's a problem because you have not been honest with me about what you're obtaining and how you intended to use it. The next one is, if you intend to obtain their information from a third party, you need to inform them that you'll be doing so. So for instance, you might be interviewing me and I'll say, oh, this information that you need, I used to work with so place, or I used to be at so place, and I don't have that information with me, but you can go and ask my bosses, or you can go and ask this previous workplace that I was at. If you're going to actually go and do that asking, you need to let me know that, oh, because you said this, I'm going to go to that third party and ask for this information. Then you have to carry out a risk impact assessment for certain stories and sources. We all know that, journalists have taken on stories that have been a risk to themselves, to their families, to their loved ones. We've seen some journalists actually lose their lives. So before you carry out any, you're seeking information from a subject, you have to carry out a risk impact assessment. So I'm coming to interview this person. Is my interview going to put them at certain risk? Are certain people going to come after them because they've spoken to me? you have to analyze it and decide that it is worth it. You have to know that their safety is compromised and that they may become a target. So you need to let them know so that they're not ignorant about it. And when they're giving you consent, they're giving you fully knowing that, oh, by speaking to you, this is what may happen. Next slide, please. So media houses should create in-house data privacy policies, organizational measures, and ensure that staff keep abreast and comply, including data protection clauses in your contracts of engagement, and you should appoint data protection officers. So yes, under the NDPA, which is the Nigerian Data Protection Act, people are mandated to actually have, there are certain organizations who are such large controllers of data that they must have data protection officers. For instance, where I work, we deal with information of over 6,000 people, staff, customers, everything. It's mandatory for us that we have a data protection officer, and we have one. We actually have a full unit, data protection unit. So you have to, and we include data protection clauses in our contracts of engagement. So if I'm a media house, say I want an independent journalist to go and get certain information from me, in the contracts that we're signing, you need to put a clause there so that it also indemnifies you. And they also know that, look, we're a data protection compliant organization. The fact that we're hiring you just for this purpose, it doesn't mean you can come and breach our own internal policies. So after today, I'm very sure that some media houses are already compliant. But for, maybe those who aren't, for independent journalists, you actually have to sit down, come up with something it's not a big deal. Just say, oh, anytime that we're interviewing people, this is what we're looking out for. This is what we're going to do. These are the rules we're going to follow. These are the things we cannot breach. Just put that all together and let them know. Then, number 16, children cannot give consent. You must always obtain consent from their parents or their legal guardians. And then the general rule is not to process sensitive data. So always err on the side of caution. I explained earlier the categories of sensitive data. I said it is something that the moment you're processing it, you know that you're putting this person at the risk of certain bias. So err on the side of caution. Why do you want to do it? Why do you want to process it? Always think of the end result. Am I going to get sued for this? There are certain exceptions, of course. Sometimes, if you recall the Ebola case, ideally, we have no business knowing anybody's health records, but we needed to know who the person was that flew into Nigeria and how Ebola came. So that's how we all knew about Sawyer and everybody. And then 18, your data subjects have a right to request rectification generally, and this should be done without undue delay. So sometimes they can come back to you and say, oh, that information that I gave you, you need to change it. I no longer live at this place, or I no longer bear this name, or I no longer work here, and then you are actually mandated to rectify that for them. If they say erase it, you are also mandated to erase it for them. Of course, with everything, there are exceptions, but just know that not complying with it, it gives them the right to lodge a complaint against you. Next slide. So data subjects have the right to request access and portability. So this basically means that after you've interviewed me, I can come back to you and say, oh, please, could you help me share this with someone else who wants to interview me, or someone else needs this for my bio, could you help me share this with them? Or some other story that you've done about them. They can come and say, maybe they have a matter in court, and they say, oh, you know what, my alibi is that this journalist was with me at so time, and there's a recording to prove that. You are mandated to actually provide that to them if they request it of you. Then always make sure that your information is secure and has integrity. So when we say make sure your information has integrity, we basically mean that know where you're getting your stories from. It's not enough to go on Twitter and then pick up agenda and pick up, oh, this person said this, that person said, then you put it together and say that's a news report. That's not a news report because you haven't properly investigated the story. We don't know where you've gotten it from. So you cannot report, for instance, gossip and say, oh, I'm putting this out. That information has no integrity whatsoever. So by integrity here, we're just saying, make sure what you're reporting, the data you're putting out is true and it's honest. Next slide, please. So these are FAQs, questions that I think you may ask. I'm sure they'll share this slide with you afterwards, so you can go through them yourself. So can we further reprocess after initial use? So this question says, yeah, depending on the nature of the personal data concerned, there are certain consequences for further processing, but if you want to do it, just go by the act and figure out what the act says. And then also know that if certain things come up, the dynamics change. So if you get information from me for just a story. And then at some point, it now has to use to be used as evidence in courts. The dynamics change. So you have to revisit it again and know, okay, what are the appropriate safeguards that we can put in place? 2, what if we decide on archiving purposes in public interest, scientific, historical, research purposes or statistical purposes? Yes, when you have data you want to keep for these reasons, it's not considered incompatible with your initial purposes, but always recheck. Next slide, please. Does the law allow you certain discretion? Yes. There are some times that the law says, okay, this is what we say, but you can deviate. So for instance, the first one is always public interest. If there's information that you need to share for public interest, then it's personal data, but the law allows you to put it out. So for example, if our president is traveling, maybe for health reasons, it ideally would not be our business, but because he's our president, his media aid can tell us, oh, he's traveling for this is why, and this is what he will be doing. So those are things that are in public interest. And it says, yes, then also for legitimate interests pursued by the journalist. So you could always read that up. So next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay, so what do you do when a breach occurs? So for instance, you have a flash drive or your laptop has been compromised or stolen, or you have a safe place where you've been keeping information, maybe someone burns it. What do you do? The first thing that you have to do is you notify your organization. So if you work for a media house, a TV house, or a newspaper house, what you have to do is immediately notify them. Oh, I had this information in my flash drive. I've been robbed at home, it's been stolen, or my laptop has been stolen. And then that your organization is mandated to notify the Nigerian Data Protection Commission within 72 hours. So the Act stipulates the sort of information you should provide. You're going to let us know what was on the drive, what's the risk associated with it, is there anybody's life who is in current danger? Then you also need to notify that person. How much can I share for international coverage of a story? So in the Act, there are certain sections that deal with what we call cross-border transfers. So if there's any information you have to move outside of Nigeria, certain sort of data, it has to be in compliance with the Act. So there's a section that deals specifically with that. Then what happens if someone has levied a complaint against me or us? Remember I said when I use me or us, it could be you as an organization or you as an indie journalist. So the first thing is to decide where the complaint has been levied against you. Is it the Nigerian Data Protection Commission, or have they sued you in court? If it's the commission would entirely decide if the matter is even worth their time. If it's vexatious, if it's frivolous, and then if they do decide, they can actually give rulings. The law has empowered them to give rulings on it. If you do not like the ruling, you can then apply for a judicial review at the court. And then, of course, if someone has gone straight to court to sue you, just lawyer up. Your lawyer is going to let you know the next steps to take. Next slide, please. Yeah, so sometimes what are the things that you could be asked to do? You could be asked to pay compensation, you could be asked to pay damage. If it's information you've profited from, you could be asked to render account of the profit and pay a fine from it. And then please also know that under the NDP, that's the Act, we have what is called the joint and vicarious liability. This basically means that if you run a media company and one of your journalists or one of your broadcast media person goes on a frolic of their own and then commit something under the name of your organization, you can actually be held accountable alongside your organization as well. So this is not like, oh, it's Podge that did this or it's Guardian that did it. We would go after the principal officers as well. So what do you do if you don't agree with the NDPC decision? Like I said, you can apply to the court for a judicial review. Next slide, please. So these are just article samples I pulled on the internet, letting you see how data protection has been complied with. So here, this is reporting the arrest of Evans, the notorious kidnapper. And it says Evans, I had this in red. Evans was arrested at his residence at number 3, Fred Shoboyede Street, Magodo. This actually had nothing to do with the information. This had no business being out there. If you are saying this is where Evans was operating, then you can say that. But when you see he was arrested at his residence, there's absolutely no need for us to have that information. So remember what I said earlier about minimization. Always pick what you're putting out. Do we actually have to put this out? For this, the answer for me was no. Next slide, please. Okay, so for this one, we have the personal data of somebody out here, a victim, and it says Mr. Donatius, and it says he's the owner of so pharmaceutical company. So now this is us putting out someone's name, where someone works, putting out information about what he owns. Ideally, we shouldn't have this out. But like we said, for legitimate interest, it was important for the journalist here to let us see why this man was a target. You can already tell if you're the owner of a big, pharmaceutical company, it makes you an easy target for kidnappers. They think that there's money there. So yes, in this instance, it was okay for this information to be put out. Next slide, please. Okay, so this one says, brothers rape a 4-year-old girl in Lagos. This was actually brilliant reporting. It just says the brothers said to be 10 and 15 years old. There's nobody's name because they are minors, and it was very important that we protect the identities of minors. Even though these minors committed a crime, they're still minors. So there is no information here of the boys, of the girl, just their age. And this is actually good reporting. So next slide, please. Yeah, this is another example of good reporting. When I said earlier, pseudonymization, minimization, and minimization, when you put reports like this out there and you say, consequently, name redacted, this is actually brilliant, and this is what you're supposed to do. And okay, I don't know if you know this story, but the name that has been redacted, it means that the journalist knew the name, but this was a minor. So it was important not to put her name out, but they had that information. So remember when I said you can nuke as much as you want, as much as you can, but then it's now up to you to know what you can put out and what you can put out. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is someone's international passport data page. Ideally, this has no business being on the internet, but this was actually, this came with a report saying that the person here who is facing criminal allegations in Nigeria and has not been able to, or rather hasn't come to face trial. And the reason for this, or part of the reason for this, is that this person has citizenship in another country. So the reporter is one, letting us know that they're in another country, they've gotten citizenship of another country, and because of that, it's even harder to extradite them to come face charges here. So they've obtained that information and they've put this out as proof. So in this instance, yes, you may call this legitimate interest for the journalist. So that's why ordinarily this information would be a breach, but in this instance, you could say, well, yes, the journalist had to put this out to prove his points. Next slide, please. I already mentioned this, the Ebola example. So I said, people's health records, it has no business being outside, but this was an issue of national importance. So it was important to have this out. So this was good reporting. Next slide, please. Thank you. So I can now take questions from the comment section.
Thank you very much, Chioma, for essentially demystifying Nigeria's Data Protection Act for us. I think you've done a great job of explaining even the basics of what data is, the very important terminologies around who's a data processor, who's a data controller, what personal sensitive personal information is versus general personal data. And you've also broken down how we, especially as journalists, can comply with the law while still doing our jobs as members of the 40th State of Rank. In the interest of time, we're going to take just 2 questions. And first, Obina from Onitsha asked, what should a journalist do if he or she is threatened to release sensitive private information under duress?
Okay, so what would a journalist do? I would answer if they and if they were employees of an organization. If they're employees of an organization, remember I mentioned earlier, it's always important to have a data protection policy. So the first thing to do is to notify your employers. This is what I'm going through. This is what is happening. This is the information that is being sort of need to release. So it falls fully under, it's the responsibility of your employer to protect you. Because in that instance, they were the data controllers. They were the ones who decided what was to be obtained and how it was going to be used. So they owe you that responsibility. So you just go back to them and go back to your company policies and decide how you're going to deal with threats like that. So in your policy, you should actually have how we're going to deal with threats. What are we going to do? Are we going to report to the police? Are we going to do this, do that? So I would say that would be fully on the organization. Personally, any threats to your well-being, if you were just an independent journalist, any threats to your well-being, you know that you should actually go straight to the law enforcement agencies and not release the information, actually. You should not release the information.
Okay, except maybe a gun is on your head, you know. And you have to speak. All right, the second question here from Abayomi in the Q&A section. He's asked what I guess is a concern for most Nigerians. Talks about how secure our data, most of his personal data is, especially with frequent breaches in financial institution databases, as well as the databases of government agencies. I guess that's what the law is here to do, but you want to speak to that?
Okay, so when you say how secure are your information with them, the answer is really that it is as much secure as that information, as that organization decides it will be secure. So which is why we have laws like this helping us, helping the data subject, and also helping us in case there's been a breach. So these laws, remember I just dealt with a certain portion of it. I dealt with part 5, section 24 up until the end. There are other sections that deal with various other things. So it's mandatory for every organization, your banks, your financial institutions, your schools, everybody, they all have data protection regulations that they have to abide by. So now you just have to trust that they are abiding by it. And sometimes they are mandated to give it to you. So for instance, you visit a website and you see we collect cookies. That's actually mandatory. All websites that are collecting it should have that. So, you know, that's already them being compliant. So it's easy to see who is compliant and who is not compliant. If you notice anything, just ask them why. Say, oh, you're milking this, but this is not in compliance with this. And if you notice a breach, you always have a right of redress. That's what this section, that's what the Nigerian Data Protection Act is actually helping you for. You know, so always figure out what has been the breach and what are your next lines of action. If it's to whether you want to start wondering how secure it is, it's you just have to trust that you're complying with the regulations.
Okay, thank you so much, Choma. I mean, I'm sure we can go on and on this. The very important topic, a very topical one as well. And Nigeria now also has a 2023 law, which I'm sure the regulators are finding those who to make scapegoats of. So it's important that everybody
very much so.
Gets their acts right, and our journalists are not exemption. So thank you so much, Choma, for your time and for the insights you've shared with us. We would compile other questions if there are and share with you, and you can
oh yes, I'll be happy to answer via mail.
Respond to those questions, and we'll share with those who said them. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Once again, thank you everyone for joining us at this 10th edition of our PwC Annual Capability Enhancement Workshop for Journalists. It's like we stated, it's part of our corporate responsibility initiatives and ways we are giving back to society by supporting the development of the best writing journalism out of Nigeria. Like we said, it's 2 initiatives. One is this workshop. The second would be is our annual Media Excellence Awards, for which I know most of us have sent in entries. The winners of that competition will be announced at a virtual gala night holding in about a week from now on Friday, the 6th of October. And we hoped that most of you who sent in entries and all the reporters working here in Nigeria will join us on the day. Before we go into the next presentation, I have maybe one apology or 1.5 apology to make. If you permit me, first is that we had advertised a session on AI and the tools you can use for journalism, which was to be facilitated by Arise TV anchor, Rutu Sodiri. He's been unavoidably absent, not able to join us for this session, and we regret that he wouldn't be sharing those insights with us today. However, we would see to getting his slides and sharing it along with others to all participants at this workshop. So please accept our sincere apologies on his behalf for his absence. Second apology would be, well, the one that I described as a half would be that our next session was to be taken, of course, by Taiwo Oyedele, the chair of the Presidential Tax and Fiscal Policy Reform Committee. Well, given the nature of his job, he's been called in by his employers, if you like, the National Economic Council, for a meeting, and he's asked that another member of that panel, of that committee, joins us now to make this presentation in his stead. And it's my pleasure to welcome Siri Agbeyi, who is a partner at PwC Nigeria, who will be making this presentation on redesigning Nigeria's fiscal policy and taxation landscape for inclusive development, prospects and challenges, on behalf of Taiwo Oyedele. Thank you so much, Siri, for joining us. You can take it from here.
Thank you, Silva, and thank you for having me. Good day to everyone. Really honored to be here as well. Unfortunate that Taiwo couldn't be here. He's really our, would I say, superstar in current times. So apologies that he can't be here. I think he's even trying to reach me now. So just give me a minute, please. Okay, so good news is that Taiwo is going to join very soon. He's actually in a car, but has to settle down. So what I'll just do is maybe give the opening until he joins. Just ping me when he joins so he can take over.
Okay, thank you very much.
So this session, I guess, is focused on redesigning Nigeria's fiscal policy and the tax landscape for inclusion development, highlighting prospects and challenges. I like the fact that we started the initial session with sustainability, and Bolanle had given some good foundation on how to view sustainability or ESG from different perspectives, because whether we like it or not, all stakeholders are involved. I think from a tax standpoint, we are now at crossroads of saying, how can we sustainably generate revenue? Because we need those also to meet some of the sustainable development goals that have been laid out by the UN under the Paris Agreement, one of which is also eradicating poverty. And one of the key ways that economies would typically grow is through taxes, because that's a major mainstay of revenue for economies. So Nigeria is at that point where we definitely need to critically look at this. And I think some of the macroeconomic indices will also shed more light on why this is very important. So this session is really focused on the prospects, looking at the challenges that we've had so far, and also looking at how the Fiscal Policy and Tax Reforms Committee can be very instrumental to redesigning the landscape for inclusive development. So I'll probably go to the next slide. Okay. Please. Is Taiwo here now?
All right, Taiwo has
Yes.
joined us now.
Oh, fantastic. All right. So, Taiwo, do you want to take it from there? I see you're still in your car.
Yes, I can take it from here, but please still be on standby in case anything happens to my connection.
Okay, or the president calls you. That's fine.
All right.
All right. Okay.
So can people hear me very well?
Yes, loud and clear, Taiwo. Can hear
Yes,
you.
All
yes,
right.
yes.
So thank you, everyone, and apologies that I couldn't join early on time because I got called just 2 days ago to come for this meeting, which is also very important. So the topic that I'm discussing is around the Nigeria's fiscal policy and taxation landscape. And the point there is, how do we ensure that we redesign it to accomplish inclusive development, but realizing that there will be challenges and also opportunities. If we can move on to the next slide. So the outline is to start with Nigeria's socioeconomic context and then ask ourselves, how did we get here? And where do we like to be if we don't like where we are now? And more importantly, how do we get there? What are those prospects and opportunities? What are the challenges? And then I'll conclude. So next slide. Yeah, you can move on as well. So on this next slide, you see trying to summarize the previous one, the socioeconomic challenges. This one, you see to your right hand side is a multidimensional poverty index calculation that shows why the majority of our people, 133 million, are living in multidimensional poverty. And these are the dimension of the poverty from education to health, living standard, work and employment, as well as security. So, not CBN, we're going to transfer. So you see on the left there, we have economic growth has been very slow. Over the past 10 years, it's not even up to 2%. And inflation is high, which means more people are getting into poverty. Even though unemployment rate as recalculated by the MBS is now 4.1, but you have 4.1% unemployment rate, but you have 60-something% of your people living in poverty. So in other words, you have the working poor. So which means our work in finding gainful, valuable, meaningful employment continues. Nothing has really changed other than the methodology for calculating unemployment. There is a low revenue for government and therefore high public debt. And it's even worse when you look at the cost of servicing the debt as a percentage of our revenue, which at the federal government level was 96% last year. For various states, it will be different numbers. Some of them, we don't even know what those things are. And we see our people living to live, because the reality is that, more than 95% of Nigerians can't even leave the country, even if they want to. So the small percentage that are able to leave, a high percentage of them are leaving. Not only are individuals leaving the country, we also have businesses are leaving the country. Whether it's game, whether it's ShopRite managed to sell their franchise to someone else, but effectively they left. We've seen Unilever cut down on their production. That's a company that's been around for almost a century. So these challenges are there, and unfortunately not where we like to be, but it's our current reality. So on the next slide, you will see an analysis of in terms of what kind of revenue we collect as a percentage of GDP and our public debt, as well as how happy our people are. So incidentally, one thing that is very apparent from this slide is that the countries that collect the highest revenue as a percentage of GDP, like Finland and Denmark, you would expect that people should be unhappy there because they are paying so much in taxes. But incidentally, those are the countries where we have the happiest people on earth. So why are people paying so much taxes and they are still happy? The answer is in the second column. Look at public expenditure to GDP. So whatever they are collecting in revenue, which is very high, it will feel like when you pay $1,000 in taxes, you get benefit of $1,200 back. Who wouldn't like that? So hence, the people are happy. And for many of these countries, the additional amount they spend is not by borrowing. They are even getting some of it from returns on their sovereign. Can you move to the next slide? My iPad. All right. So on these next slide is a question of how did we get to where we are, which is not where we like to be. And I think the answers are what I've put under three broad headings. The first one is we have cultural issues, and that is our attitude towards paying taxes. And that cuts across from the leaders, in some cases, political authorities at the highest level, and even government MDAs. You see MDAs are defaulting in paying taxes. It's actually sometimes very difficult to understand, right? You are the head of an agency of government. It's not your money. The money belongs to the people, but you're not willing to pay it to government. And then you see individuals, including politicians, during the run-up to the last election. We see many of them didn't even have tax clearance certificates, and they were contesting to be governors, senators, and the rest of it. And then we have vested interests, where some people are happy collecting revenue and mismanaging them. So some of the taxes that our people pay are not getting to the government. So which means that people are paying the taxes because it's not getting to government. It means that there's no way to even spend the money for the people. Then we have structural issues. Those structural issues start all the way from the constitution itself, around the right to tax, and also we've placed too much burden on the poorest people in Nigeria. So you find that the bulk of the money collected by way of personal income tax is coming from PAYE. So richest people in the world don't pay PAYE because they are not paid salaries. So in Nigeria in 2016, 2017, when we did VAT, it turns out that about 96% of the revenue at state level was from PAYE. So, and that's the direct opposite of what you find in many countries, where the top 1%, top 2%, top 3% are the one carrying the burden of taxation for their country. So we need to review that, and we need to change that in Nigeria. Then you have situational issues, which is really people just, taking advantage of the system where sometimes they consider it as lawless, and it's almost like anything goes and you can do whatever you like, particularly if you're highly connected. You can almost do anything and then get away with it. So to be able to address these challenges, we need to develop a new culture. We need to build trust with the people. And then we need to develop new policies as well as legal reforms. Some of these problems emanate even from the Constitution itself. And then we need to build capacity around people as well as processes. So those are the things you find, under the slide over here. So if you move on to the next slide. So this slide is showing us a little bit more in terms of the challenges of how we got here. And you see that to the right of that slide is the aggregate budget of states in 2021. They budgeted that they were going to spend about 8.2 trillion naira. But then if you go down and you see the revenue, their IGR was only 1.3 trillion. Their FAC was only 2.2 trillion, which means there was a 4.6 trillion, more than half of what they budgeted for. They had no idea where the money was going to come from. And when this happens, you can guess what will suffer, right? It is capital expenditure that will suffer. They will still take care of recurrent and overhead. And the more we are unable to spend, the moment we are unable to spend enough on capital expenditure and human capital development, the more we are far away from development, the more that our people spend time being poor. So on the next slide, this is just showing you the multiplicity of taxes that we have across different levels of government. So this first slide are the taxes that the federal government can collect legitimately based on the approved list of taxes and levies. On the next one are the ones that state government can collect. So there are 25 of them. And then on the following one are the ones that local government can collect, which is 21. If you add it all up, you are easily looking at over 60 different taxes and levies. And the interesting thing is, while we have over 60 taxes and levies that government can collect, in fact, about 99% of our revenue is coming from less than 10 taxes. In other words, people are paying these many other taxes, but it's not really getting to government. So the simple solution to that problem would easily be to repeal all those over 50 taxes that are barely yielding 1% of revenue. So the people can truly have the peace of mind to do their legitimate businesses. And then government would collect more. So people will pay less, government will collect more because you remove the inefficiency and the wastage and the corruption in the process of revenue administration. So this next slide is a question about, because of all these complications around multiple taxation, complexity of the system, it has resulted in very low tax morale, where people don't want to pay their taxes, and you wouldn't blame them. And when we conducted a study at the NESG on tax perception across Nigeria, we then found out that only 17% of Nigerian adults truly want to pay their taxes correctly. So around 83% will not mind evading their taxes. When we asked them why, the number one reason they gave is that they do not trust government. The second reason is that the little that they have paid, what are they getting in return for those taxes they paid? And number three reason was that the tax system is too complex even when you want to comply. So which means the solution to our problems are not too complicated. We need to address issues around trust, which will require accountability and transparency on the part of government and the quality of spending, as well as simplify the tax system and then make sure that we prioritize what's important to the people in terms of spending, not what is most important to the politicians. So where we need to be, that's the next slide. We need to get to a point where we collect better. We need to get to a point where we budget better. We need to get a point where we spend better. We need to get to a point where we manage better. And then we need to report better. So all of these areas are areas where we need to make fundamental changes to how we manage the economy. So it has to be that the burden of tax is no longer disproportionately on the poorest, but people should pay based on their ability with more emphasis at the top of the ladder. So if you move on, you will see the next slide is comparing Nigeria with South Africa. So South Africa is 60 million people. Nigeria is over 200 million people. Nigeria collected just a little over 15 trillion naira in the last fiscal year across all levels of government. That's Federal Inland Revenue Service, Nigerian Customs Service, all 36 state Internal Revenue Service, FCT, Internal Revenue Service, everybody collecting taxes in Nigeria, barely 16 trillion naira. Whereas if you look at South Africa, a smaller economy, less than 1/4 or 1/3 of our population, they collected 78 trillion naira, which means, and if you look at it actually from personal income tax alone, from value-added tax alone, from corporate income tax alone, individually, those taxes yielded more than the entire revenue of Nigeria for South Africa. So it has to be that there's something we are doing wrong fundamentally that we need to address. Interestingly, these amounts of huge revenue that South Africa collects is coming from less than 10 taxes, corroborating the point that to collect more, you don't need more taxes. In fact, the contrary holds true, which means you need less taxes, and then you'll be able to collect even more. So how do we get to that point where we want to be? So that leads to the work of the Presidential Committee on Fiscal Reform and Tax policy. So the mandate of the committee is divided into 3 pillars. One is fiscal governance, the second one is revenue transformation, and the third one is economic growth facilitation. Now, if you break this down, we have 5 dimensions, which means we're going to be looking at Nigeria's tax policy and review it. Our plan is that when we are done with our work, there'll be a 2023 national tax policy. We also want to look at the laws. Many of the tax laws today we inherited from our colonial masters before many of us were born. So we need to rewrite them so they are simple, so that they are modern, and so that they protect the poor and also allow everybody who has the ability to pay the right amount. Then revenue administration needs to be better. Then we have fiscal management, which is really around debt, deficits, how we spend, coordination between monetary and fiscal authority. And then the last one, which is fiscal competitiveness and economic growth, is focusing on the best way to raise revenue for any country is to grow your economy. When people find jobs, they pay taxes. When they buy things, they pay VAT. When businesses make profit, they pay tax. So actually, the best way to raise revenue is to improve the economy. So what are the prospects and challenges? Because it's not that easy and it's not all rosy, otherwise we will not be where we are today. The challenges range from multiple taxation to multiplicity of agencies, everybody trying to collect revenue. In fact, the federal government in this 2023 budget had about 63 MDAs that they have been given and have been given revenue targets. So the problem with that is these agencies were not set up to collect taxes, and therefore they have no competence in collecting taxes. Number 2, they are distracted from their primary mandate of why they were set up. So that distraction needs to be taken away so that there's a system to collect the taxes on their behalf while they focus on their core mandate. So the core mandate for customs service is border protection and trade facilitation. If you go to NCC, primary mandate is to improve telecommunication so we don't have calls that are dropping, right? And so on and so forth. We have fragmented system, rudimentary. We still have people doing roadblock to collect taxes. It's almost like, 1920. So in this modern age, you should not have anybody stopping you on the road, sometimes in the middle of nowhere, and then asking you to pay taxes. We have high costs of revenue administration. We have instances of agencies collecting as high as 7%, 10%, 15%, when the international benchmark is actually 1% for cost of collection. There's a lack of coordination, both within the federal government and across subnational. And then there's poor accountability in how taxpayers' money are being spent. So these are the challenges, but you can turn them around and they'll become opportunities. the opportunities for us is how can you attain a single digit of number of taxes across all levels? Can we clarify the taxing rights all the way to the Constitution? You can go and pack. So you clarify taxing rights. So what that means is an issue like VAT, which has been very controversial. So how do we ensure that we define it properly? Should it be collected by the federal government on behalf of the federation? Should it be collected by the state? That issue hasn't been addressed, and that problem will not go away by us just wishing it away. We have to do something about it. I've spoken about integrating tax collection function and how we are hoping that our tax to GDP ratio would increase to a minimum of 18% over the next 3 years, so that government can rely less and less on borrowing to finance public spending. It is clear to us. And how we get there is also something we have outlined. So which means part of the meeting I have today was trying to speak to the governors to, support what we're doing, even though our committee was set up by the president, but the mandate of the committee, government, state government. So we cannot accomplish our objectives by just focusing on the federal government alone. So everybody needs to work together, including even the private sector. So we're going to be starting our stakeholder engagement in the next few days. And we've outlined engagement session, including with the media, with Nigerians living with disability, Nigerians in the diaspora, small businesses, women associations, multinational. So we're not leaving anybody out. Whether you're a big company, whether you're a foreigner, whether you're a local person, so long as you are investing in Nigeria, we want to listen to you. We want to take your issues into account. I want to be able to work together for the progress of our country. So on that last, there's a quote that I use a lot, which is a quote by Abraham Lincoln that says the best way to predict the future is to create it. So if you don't like what you see now, it's not just by prayer and fasting, it is by taking steps to create the future that you want for yourself. And we're very clear that that future cuts across revenue generation, how we spend money, and more importantly, how we account for the money that we have spent. So what I have. Thank you for your kind. Take a few questions for the remaining time that I have left.
Thank you so much, Taiwo. Thank you so much. It's always a delight listening to you, and importantly, also giving us a lot more insights to the work of your committee, the size of the problem, the opportunities therein, and how your committee is looking to, demystify it all and create value for all of us as Nigerians. Thank you very much for joining us, even straight from your meeting. Of course, there are a few questions here. We'll take a few. So quickly, I'll read out from the box. So the first is, good day, sir. I'm glad that the president made a wise decision in being sincere, to bring sincere experts like you on board. I pray that you achieve, I pray that you achieve success in this tax drive. Nigerians are not willing to pay because government is not accountable to the people. Let taxing or taxation start from the rich, politicians and the multinational, if the measure of success if we intend to have success recorded, then Nigeria will start paying. Now, the question really is, do you think government is sincere enough to judiciously spread revenue generated from taxation to healthcare, education, and housing, given the present situation in the country? How much of the solutions you mentioned can be achieved? And I guess this is coming from a long history of having solutions that are not implemented. And I wish to also, and then of course, she wishes you all the very best in your role. So that's the first question. Taiwo wants to take that.
Yes. Thank you for the kind words from that person. You're right. I think that the poor has carried the burden of taxation in Nigeria for so long. So it's time for them to also take some rest, right? So what that means is fundamentally, we want to redesign the system so that the burden is taken away from the poorest, and the middle class and the upper class need to now start bearing the burden. So that's really what we're planning to do. Is government sincere to spend the money to take care of the people rather than for their own interests? We see some signs of willingness, but again, when we talk about these, bear in mind that you're easily talking about, one government at the center, 36 at the state, and 774 at the local government. So it's very unlikely you get everybody to be on board from day one, but we want to start it almost like a revolution. When we had the presentation today to NEC, the governors, majority of them, easily agree with what we propose, including a platform for spending. So like this subsidy removal now, the savings that is coming from it, what if we have a portal where you can go and, see all the states, you select a state, you see all the local government, you select a local government, you see all the project that is ongoing with the involvement of the media and the civil society reporting. So it will not be audio projects. So you're reporting the progress of that project, including video, like the sacrifice they have made with subsidy removal is worthwhile because they are seeing the benefit in their lives. Roads from farm to market, solar power storage so that farmers stop losing 60% of their tomatoes, making sure that you have vocational center where people can acquire skills, making sure you have provisions that allow Nigerians who are in Nigeria to work within the international value chain where they can even earn dollars while they are here in Nigeria. So those things are possible, and we'll try our best to push this to them. The good thing about the committee that was set up, that I have the opportunity to share, is that when
So it appears you're mute now. We can't hear you. Okay, good. Go ahead.
A call came in. So I'm saying that the good thing about the committee is that we are doing both implementation and recommendation as we go along. So this will not be a committee where you write a report and you then hope and pray that it's implemented. No, we're going to be implementing as we go along. So that way we'll put pressure on the politicians to also play their part.
Okay, thank you, Taiwo. Just take a quick one. Next question here from Matthew Dadia. He's asking, and I think this is a topic I've seen a few discussions around on social media. There are this issue of alcohol, being destroyed because of religious reasons in some parts of the country. Yet those states where this is destroyed enjoy from the taxation that has been made on those alcohol from where they were produced. And he's asking, is there a way to solve this challenge?
That's an interesting. That's an interesting question, and it goes to what we call fiscal equity. So if you are not allowing me to sell an item, why are you sharing in the tax? So we think that the solution to this is very simple. And that solution is to share VAT revenue based only on derivation. So you should not share on equality, on population. Those things are irrelevant to how revenue is generated. So whatever economic activities are carried out in your territory, we use that to pay you the money back, right? So if you decide that you don't want entertainment, you don't want alcohol, you may even say that you don't even want food. So whatever you don't want, then you don't share in it. And the data for us to be able to do that today is available already. So these are some of the the recommendations we hope to be able to introduce and implement as we go along. But I have to say that this alcohol conversation is not a big issue, because when we did the analysis, the percentage of VAT revenue that is coming from alcohol is between 2 to 3%. So it's less than 3%. So which means even if you take it out and you share the revenue, it won't make much difference. But I think in principle, then it's wrong. And to that extent, I would agree with that question.
Okay. Thanks again, Taiwo. Otto Basia Kong is asking, what's your committee thinking about the TSA? Will you recommend stringent penalties for RGAs? I believe that will be revenue generating agencies of government who do not remit. Also, he's asking, are you considering removing SEC from the RGA list to enable it focus on capital markets regulations? He has a third part to the question. I think he's been able to kill 3 birds with 1 stone. He asks, how are the proposed reforms aligning with emerging technologies to improve tax collection? Essentially, I think, how are we going to bring in technology to make tax collection more efficient, tax collection and administration more efficient in Nigeria?
Yeah, good questions. The first one around TSA. We are not looking at TSA in isolation, and that's the Treasury single account, because it's just a tool. The TSA is a tool. What we want to do is to look at the whole transparency of how government revenues are collected, how they are kept, how they are accounted for, and how they are reported. So that process would essentially take us into looking at TSA as well. But we're not limiting ourselves to TSA alone. Like you rightly observe, there are some agencies that are exempted from TSA and they control large amounts of resources. We also want to know what they're doing. I think TSA is just simply about how you bank the government revenue. So that process needs to be transparent, and involving the TSA as one of the tools we use is clearly a step in the right direction. What has been missing is we haven't built on that since it was introduced. We need to get it better. Should we be removing SEC so that they can focus on regulation? I wouldn't say that being included in the TSA, reduces your focus. It doesn't. In fact, the people who are running the SEC or any organization don't even need to know how the monies are being kept and reported, right? You need to do regulation, whether there's transparency in the capital market. How can we attract, global companies to list in Nigeria? How can you create opportunities for capital raising for fintech? So those things have nothing to do with whether you are on TSA or not. So we think those things can be addressed in parallel. Address quality of regulation for the capital market while still being transparent in terms of your revenue reporting and accounting. Alignment with technology, definitely. There's really nothing you can do now and you raise your hand up and say we are one of the best in the world without using technology. It's almost impossible. So whether you're talking about the tax policy itself, whether you're talking about tax administration, reporting, monitoring of spending, all of these significant components of it will be relying on technology. So we're working on a project called Data for Tax. And the plan with that is to be able to connect the intelligence we have within the Nigerian economy. So if somebody has, 4 houses in Abuja, 3 bank accounts, including one in maybe UK and US, and they've not paid taxes or they've paid only 5,000 naira, the system will tell you that they are hiding their income and wealth. And then you can collect the right amount of tax. And then if government says we've spent 1 billion and they haven't done the project that they claim that they were doing, technology can easily show us, like what budget is doing, which I think many of us need to support even more. So budget will spotlight projects in different places. Some people will collect government money. They'll go and build one scrappy project and put their name there and use it to campaign, right? So those things have to stop. And technology can easily help you to track what people are doing to change behavior around spending. So that's the way I'll respond to those questions.
Hey, Taiwo, thank you. I know you understand that you're a very good friend of the media, and when they have you around, there are a lot of questions come through. We'll just take a few more, given how you've had a long day, and so that you can take some rest. Joseph Olaoluwa is asking about where we are really on the issue of informal taxation, and I believe perhaps he's talking about taxation of the informal sector. Says the last time government said they will collect, but people like market women are worried about double taxation. So he's just asking, where are we now, and perhaps what's the committee's position on this?
Yes, indeed. The informal sector, they're paying too many taxes. We had a meeting with the officers of MATAN, that's the Market Traders Association guys, and they said that people who sell pure water alone, just selling pure water in the market, they said they pay 7 tickets every day. They call it tickets, but it's really taxes. So imagine you're selling pure water and you're paying 7 tickets a day. Somebody is transporting food item from one state to another, and they pay more than 30 different taxes just to bring food from point A to point B. And then we're surprised that the price of food is rising and people can't afford it. These are problems we've imposed on ourselves, self-inflicted pain that we need to address. So what we want to do is to find a way to protect the informal sector. We think that many of them, maybe more than 90% of them, should not pay tax at all because they're just struggling to survive. And the small percentage that needs to pay the tax, it should just be one tax that they can pay once. Imagine something you can pay on your phone. It doesn't have to be a smartphone, star something. You pay the tax, and the receipt is sent to your phone. If you lose that phone or you delete the message, you dial star something and the receipt shows up again. So when anybody stops you, you just show them your phone and they see that you have paid. Instead of putting roadblock, harassing people, just imagine what you see in places like Lagos. They ask you, there was a story I read about a tailor. The woman couldn't even find the money to enter transport. So she trekked to, the roadside where she was doing her tailoring. She hadn't even sold 1 naira, and they showed up and they said she needed to pay 400 naira. So she was begging, and they removed the head of the machine and ran away, right? And the woman started crying. So you can't do that. That's just wickedness. So those issues are part of what we are planning to address. So nobody will have to do that to anyone ever again in the country. We think that this is possible and is doable.
I think the last question we'll take, Taiwo. Yeah, you might have just often spoken to it. Ayuade Olatukewa from Kiss FM in Abuja is asking what the committee is going to recommend to take off illegal tax officers, tax collectors, touts and louts from market and roadsides. Because even when the people know they are illegal, they are very forceful and violent, and they seem to have backing of various governments that they represent. So the people are often helpless and have to respond.
Yeah, awesome question. So that's correct. We think that the way to deal with those illegal tax collectors who are mostly touts is not really to go to them, is to go to their principals. So we are starting with the governors. So if a governor of a state decide that those guys should not be on the road, you probably have solved 50% of the problem. And then you cascade it down to the level of, the chairman of local governments. Some of them are Baba Isale or whatever they are. So there's someone who is a big person somewhere who is well connected that is sending them to be on the road. So we tackle it from that point. And then the rest of it, we will use the power of the law. So once we outlaw collection of taxes in cash or blocking roads, anybody that they see doing that, you pick the person up. And part of what we are even planning to do is, if they force you to pay, because sometimes you find yourself in the middle of nowhere, that's not the time to be quoting the law and speaking big grammar. It won't solve your problem. You just have to pay and then move on, right? So when you pay like that, you see the evidence of payment. If you can take a picture of the person that collected from you, we'll create a portal where you upload that information, and then we can then use that to track it. So there will be consequences for those illegal tax collectors, and you get your money back. Once we verify that you were asked to pay illegally, we pay you the money back, and we deduct it from the local government or state where that collection happened, because it's their duty to make sure that those illegal collectors are not there. If they are there, you can't blame me as a citizen for being harassed and extorted. That's why you have a government. You should blame the government for allowing that illegality to continue. So that's what we plan to do.
Ladies and gentlemen, that was Taiwo Oyedele, Presidential Committee Chair of the Committee on Fiscal Policy and Tax Reforms. Taiwo, thank you so much for your time. That was the last question. And right now is just to appreciate you and wish you and your committee the very best, and to note that, you know, the nation is actually looking up to what comes out of your committee and how that changes the fortune of our country. Thank you so much, Taiwo.
Thank you very much for that. Thank you to all the participants, and thank you to Asiri for being on standby for me for this presentation. I'm actually just about heading out now for another meeting with the new central bank governor and his team. So this has just finished on time for me to get there. So we'll be having engagement with stakeholders, including the media. So we'll have more opportunities to engage. And we are relying on the media to help us tell the story correctly, so that our people are able to understand what we're doing. We can build trust, and we can build a country that we are all going to be proud of. Thank you very much, and do enjoy the rest of the day and the conference. And thank you, PwC, for putting this together and for inviting me.
Yes, it's good to hear you say that. I'm speaking from the other side now. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye for now.
All right. Cheers. Bye-bye. All right. Gentlemen and ladies of the press, thank you for your time. Special thanks to all our facilitators, Bolanle Adekoya, Dr. Andrew Nevin, who joined us from the United States, Chioma Ilozumba, and of course, Taiwo Oyedele, whose session just ended. We really appreciate you all for making time to join. We hope and believe that this has been very useful session, very time well spent. Like we promised, this content will be available, both the recording and the presentations will be available, and we'll also collect any unanswered questions and get the respective facilitators to provide responses that will be shared with our participants. Once again, I want to remind us of the gala night to announce winners of this year's Media Excellence Awards, which will be holding next week, Friday, 6th of October, by 4 p.m. If you are yet to get an invite and you wish to attend, please indicate, and we would make that available to you. However, just know that everyone who sent in an entry will receive an invite in the coming days with joining instructions for this session. So just look out for that in the coming days. Once again, thank you, and do have a very good evening. Bye from us.